Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin. The woods had always called to Jack. There was something in the air there, a weight, a pull that wrapped around him like a thick fog. He'd tried to explain it to people before, but they never seemed to understand. No one ever understood the way the woods felt alive. Not in the way a tree or a bird, or even the wind was alive. No, this was something darker, something older. He hadn't meant to go as deep into the forest as he did that day. It started innocently enough, a lazy Sunday afternoon. His mind drifted with the endless drone of cicadas and the distant calls of hawks. The idea of being outside felt like a release, a break from the endless thoughts that had begun to suffocate him at home. So, he packed a small bag and wandered off the beaten path, convinced he'd be back before nightfall. But somewhere along the way, he got lost, and as the afternoon sun dipped lower, the world around him grew quieter, denser, darker. It wasn't until he stumbled upon the house that he realized how far he'd gone. The house was like something out of a nightmare. It stood at the edge of a clearing, partially obscured by the thick underbrush that had grown up around it, as though nature itself had tried to reclaim it. The walls were gray and rotting, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Broken windows stared out like empty, hollow eyes. A porch, long since abandoned, drooped at the front, and the front door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. The air around it felt cold and wrong, like stepping into a room where the air hadn't been stirred in ages. Jack stopped in his tracks, staring at the house. It wasn't so much the house itself that unnerved him. It was the feeling, that creeping, gnawing sensation in his gut that whispered, "You shouldn't be here." But curiosity had always been his weakness, and there was something about that house, a pull, that made it impossible to resist. Maybe it was the door, half open as if waiting for him. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to whisper his name in a language he couldn't quite understand. He approached the house slowly, his boots crunching against the dry, brittle leaves. The silence was unnerving. Not a bird chirped, not a single animal scurried in the underbrush. The woods felt empty, as if the whole world had abandoned this place. And yet, the house stood as if it had always been there and would continue to be long after he was gone. He reached for the door. The moment his hand brushed against the wood, a sharp, jagged sound cracked the stillness. The door squeaked open on its own, a painful, high-pitched wail that made him flinch. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. He stepped over the threshold, his foot sinking slightly into the rotting floorboards, and took in his surroundings. The entryway was narrow, with a staircase that curled up to the second floor. A dim light filtered in through the broken windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The smell of mildew and old wood mixed with something else, something musty and foul, like damp earth. His breath hitched in his throat as he stepped further into the dark, his eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The walls were covered with peeling wallpaper, faded and stained in places. It was as if the house had been abandoned for a lifetime, and yet there was something off about it, something that made him hesitate. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't fear, not at first. It was more like an unease, a creeping sensation that slithered under his skin and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, but from every direction at once. He pushed it away and continued into the house. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, but there was something about them, something almost familiar. It was like the house itself was alive, shifting underfoot, groaning in protest. The deeper he went, the stronger the pull became. It was as though the house wanted him to find something, or maybe it wanted something from him. He wandered through the living room, where a tattered couch lay collapsed under the weight of time. A fireplace sat on one wall, its mantle cracked, covered in layers of dust and ash. But it was something in the corner of the room that caught his eye. A trap door, hidden beneath a ragged rug. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. It was small, about the size of a manhole, with a rusty metal handle that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The edges of the door were stained dark with age, the wood warped and splintered. It looked out of place, too clean, too neat, in a room that had clearly seen its fair share of neglect. Jack felt a cold tingle at the back of his neck, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The door called to him, a whisper on the edge of his consciousness. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was as though the house had chosen him. He couldn't turn back. His pulse quickened, and that voice in the back of his mind returned, louder this time, telling him to leave, to turn around and never look back. But it was too late. He crouched down and grabbed the metal handle. The moment his fingers touched it, a shock of cold ran up his arm, making him gasp. It felt like touching ice, as if the door were freezing from the inside out. Despite the chill that ran through him, he yanked it open. The darkness that greeted him was deep and suffocating. He could feel the cold air seeping up from below, a dampness that seemed to pull the warmth from his body. He hesitated, standing at the top of the stairs that led down into the pitch-black void. The smell hit him then, something sour, like rotting meat, mixed with the metallic tang of blood. His heart hammered in his chest. He had to step back. The idea of going down into that darkness made him sick, but his legs refused to listen, the curiosity pulling him forward, step by slow step, deeper into the unknown. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he couldn't turn back. Maybe it was the house. Maybe it was the pull of something ancient, buried deep beneath the floorboards. But there was something about this place, something that made him feel as though he was part of a story that had already been written, a story he couldn't escape. The stairs creaked beneath his feet as he descended into the darkness. Each step seemed to take longer, as though the air around him was thickening. The smell grew stronger, and the walls of the stairwell seemed to close in on him. The deeper he went, the more his surroundings seemed to warp, bending in strange angles, until he wasn't sure if the house itself had twisted into something else entirely. At the bottom of the stairs, he reached for his phone. The light flickered weakly as he turned on the flashlight, casting a small circle of light around the room. What he saw made his stomach twist. The room was small, no larger than a closet, with walls covered in strange, yellowing notes. The air was thick with dust, so heavy that it seemed to cling to his lungs, making it hard to breathe. He squinted at the papers, trying to make out the words, but they were written in strange, slanted handwriting, as though someone had scrawled them in a hurry. The flashlight flickered again, and then his heart skipped a beat. There, pinned to the wall, was a photograph of a face he didn't recognize. A man, young, with wide, fearful eyes. The photo was yellowed with age, the corners curling as though it had been there for years. But it wasn't just the photo that made him freeze. It was the fact that the man in the picture looked like him. It wasn't possible. He couldn't be the one in the picture. He wasn't, but there was something about the expression, something about the fear in the man's eyes that made him feel like his very soul had been ripped open. Something inside him told him to leave, to run. But before he could react, the air shifted, and that cold, oppressive presence, the one he'd felt since entering the house, grew heavier, closer. Something was waiting in the dark, something hungry, and now he had no way out. Jack stood frozen in the cramped underground room, his breath quickening in short, shallow gasps. The photograph, pinned crudely to the wall, was the first thing he had seen clearly, its yellowed edges curling upward as if the air itself was alive with some sinister force. He couldn't take his eyes off the man's face in the photo. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he almost didn't hear the faint, scraping sound behind him. Faint, but unmistakable. He spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand, the beam cutting through the oppressive dark. The basement room was small, suffocating, and the walls were cluttered with strange notes, maps, and what appeared to be hastily scrawled symbols. But it wasn't just the eerie nature of the room that caused his pulse to race. It was the sense that he wasn't alone. He listened, the air thick with dust, but there was nothing, only the sound of his own frantic breathing. The flashlight beam moved in erratic sweeps, catching fragments of torn paper pinned to the walls. Some of the writing looked like frantic, desperate scribblings, words repeating over and over again, incomprehensible in their sheer madness. "I'll never leave. They're coming for me. I can hear them in the walls." Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickling, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrating in the floor beneath his boots. The floor was cool, unsettlingly so, as if it were drawing the warmth from his body. The room seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own, pressing in on him with every breath he took. He raised the flashlight again, scanning the walls for anything that would explain the strange, unnerving feeling that had settled over him. That's when he noticed something strange in the corner of the room, behind a stack of brittle papers. A shape, a figure. The beam of light landed on it, and his stomach lurched. It wasn't a person, at least, not exactly. It was a figure, hunched and twisted, crouching in the far corner. At first glance, it looked like a pile of old clothes, perhaps discarded and forgotten. But there was something about the way it huddled, something about the shape of it, that made Jack's blood freeze in his veins. He wanted to turn and run. He wanted to bolt up the stairs and never look back. But his feet wouldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the floor, as if the house itself had taken hold of him. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and forced himself to approach the figure. With every step, the sound of his own heartbeat seemed to grow louder until it was all he could hear. The dim beam of light barely reached the corners of the room, and the figure, now just a vague silhouette, remained still, unmoving. Jack's hand trembled as he reached out toward it. He couldn't explain why. He knew it was wrong, knew the air was thick with danger, but something urged him forward. Something in the house wanted him to see. His fingers brushed against the cold, brittle fabric, and he jerked his hand back as if burned. The thing, it wasn't a pile of clothes at all. It was a figure, hunched over, covered in ragged, torn clothing, but the skin beneath was pale, almost translucent. Jack could see veins snaking across it like threads of ink, and the face. Oh God, the face was a blur, as if someone had tried to erase it. There were no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to stare into him, through him, as if looking at something far beyond this world. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, as the air around him grew thick, heavier. The walls felt like they were closing in, like the house was alive, breathing and suffocating him. Leave. Leave now. The thought crashed into his mind with a force that nearly made him collapse. But the whisper wasn't his own. It was coming from the walls. Jack's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. The strange symbols, now taking on a life of their own, swirling and shifting. He turned the light away quickly, his eyes wide with panic. The whispering came again, louder this time. You shouldn't be here. Jack staggered backward, heart pounding in his chest. His hand fumbled for the stairs, the path to the safety of the surface. But as he turned to flee, something caught his eye. A small wooden box, half hidden behind a stack of old, moldy papers. He couldn't help it. His hand shot out toward it, and in a moment of weakness, his curiosity overtook his fear. The box was cold to the touch, impossibly so. It felt like it had been buried in ice for years. His fingers closed around it, and a surge of cold shot up his arm. It made him gasp, but the sensation wasn't painful. No, it was deeper. Something colder, something unnatural. With trembling hands, Jack opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of yellowed cloth, was a small, weathered book. The pages were thick and worn, almost as if the book had been touched by countless hands over centuries. The cover was covered in faded symbols, unrecognizable but familiar, as though they had been seen before. He flipped it open. The pages inside were covered with more scrawling, frantic handwriting, but this time it wasn't the same as the notes on the walls. This writing was more organized, more deliberate. It seemed to bleed into his thoughts. I am trapped beneath the earth, and the walls are watching me. I can hear them in the dark. There are others. They whisper. They wait for me to leave. They wait for you too. They will come for you when you step through the door. No one leaves this place. No one. The last line was scratched out violently, as though the person who wrote it had been frantic, terrified beyond belief. Jack felt his heart race, his breath quickening as a cold sweat broke out on his brow. His hands shook uncontrollably as he turned the page. The next page was blank, except for a small, crudely drawn figure in the corner. Silhouette of a man, or something that used to be a man. The figure was staring out from the page, empty-eyed, and Jack felt a chill wash over him. That figure, those empty eyes, reminded him of the photo, of the face in the basement, the face that looked so much like his own. His stomach twisted, and a feeling of dread washed over him like a flood. He slammed the book shut, his heart hammering in his chest. He had to leave. He had to get out of there. But as he reached for the stairs, his flashlight flickered again. And this time, the light caught something in the far corner of the room. A shape, a figure. It wasn't the same thing he'd seen earlier. No, this one was different. Taller, slender, almost human, and it was moving toward him. The figure in the corner of the room began to shift, its movements slow and deliberate. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. The more Jack looked, the more it seemed to blur at the edges, like a mirage on the verge of dissolving into the dark. But it didn't dissolve. It drew closer. Jack's heart slammed in his chest, a rhythm too erratic to ignore. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body frozen to the spot as the thing, whatever it was, moved with a quiet, unnerving grace. The flashlight trembled in his hand, casting an unsteady beam that flickered with every beat of his heart, illuminating the thing for a second, then plunging the room into deeper darkness. The figure was tall, taller than any man Jack had ever seen. The way it moved was unnatural, almost as though its limbs bent in ways that human limbs shouldn't. It glided across the floor, its shadow twisting unnaturally on the walls as if the very darkness itself were alive and aware. Jack wanted to scream. His throat tightened, the air heavy, thick with dread. But the sound wouldn't come. He was suffocating in that small room, every breath an effort, as if the very space itself was pushing down on him. His legs wouldn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor, and all he could do was stare into the darkness as the figure moved closer, ever closer. Then it spoke, and the voice wasn't a voice at all. It was more like a whisper that burrowed deep into his mind, soft, cold, almost soothing, but filled with the kind of unnatural malice that made his skin crawl. "You don't belong here." Jack's chest tightened, the words reverberating in his mind long after the voice had faded. A part of him wanted to shut it all out, to throw the book away, turn, and run. But another part of him, the part that had made him open that box in the first place, the part that had been drawn to this place since the very moment he stepped inside, refused to let go. He could feel the weight of the room pressing on him now, like something ancient, something hungry, and something waiting. The walls seemed to close in, inch by agonizing inch, until there was nothing but darkness and that soft, suffocating whisper. "You're already here." The figure continued its slow approach, its body swaying, the inhuman movements mesmerizing. Its shape was wrong. Its body stretched in unnatural ways. Long arms, long fingers, too many joints bending at odd angles. But the face, or what was left of it, was the most unsettling of all. It was a face, but not. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin, stretched thin over what could only be described as a hollow skull. Yet somehow, Jack felt it looking at him. The hollowness of the face seemed to gaze into him, down to his very core, as if it could see everything that Jack had buried deep inside. Every secret, every fear, every doubt. The flashlight flickered once more, and for the briefest of moments, Jack saw something else. Something even worse. There were more of them. Behind the figure in the corner, in the oppressive gloom, Jack saw silhouettes. No, not silhouettes. Figures, huddled in the dark, their outlines indistinct, their forms twisted and malformed. More faces like the one in front of him, faceless and empty, staring back at him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. He could feel his pulse in his throat now, the rush of blood thumping in his ears. Panic clawed at him, but his body refused to respond. The shadows seemed to grow, multiplying, their dark, soulless forms creeping closer. The very air felt thick, like it was pushing against him, constricting, squeezing the breath from his lungs. And then the figure spoke again, its voice now layered with a terrible finality. "You will not leave." The words felt like ice, sinking into his skin, cold as death. Jack tried to back away, but his legs betrayed him, and he stumbled backward, his foot catching on something behind him. He hit the floor with a loud thud, pain radiating up his spine, but he didn't care. He was on the floor, staring at the figure, the thing, now standing over him. It loomed above him, the thin, skeletal limbs reaching out, its fingers twisting in grotesque, unnatural angles, as if they didn't belong in the same world as him. The sharp tips of its fingers hovered above his face, close enough to feel the coldness of its presence. "No one leaves this place." The voice wasn't just in his mind now. It was coming from all around him. The walls seemed to hum with it, vibrating, as if the very house was alive with the energy of 1,000 souls that had been trapped here before him. The air in the room thickened, swirling with a heavy, oppressive force, and Jack could feel something else stirring beneath the surface of his skin. The house was feeding on him. It was feeding on his fear, his panic, his helplessness. It was pulling at him, tearing at his will, trying to consume him whole. He could hear the distant whispering again, growing louder, faster, the voices of the other figures in the darkness. "They're coming for you. You're one of us now." The flashlight died, plunging the room into complete darkness. But Jack's eyes had already adjusted. The dark had become its own nightmare, the shadows moving on their own, twisting into forms that seemed to shift with every blink. His heart was hammering now, the sound filling his ears, drowning out the whispers, drowning out everything. His breath came in desperate gasps, his chest tight, but there was nowhere to run. "They're coming." Jack's hands trembled, and in a moment of clarity, he realized something. The thing in front of him, it wasn't the only thing in this house. There were others, thousands of others, and they weren't just shadows. They weren't just stories. They were people who had come before him, drawn into the house, lured in by the same pull that had trapped him. They were the ones who had left behind those notes, those warnings, the ones whose faces had been erased from the photographs, their souls trapped in the walls, their memories buried beneath layers of rotting wood and rusting nails. The house didn't just trap you in the dark, it changed you. A sudden, violent cold washed over him, deeper than anything he had ever felt, deeper than the darkest corners of his mind. It felt like the house was taking hold of him, carving away pieces of himself, stripping him of who he was, until he was nothing but a hollow shell. A face in a photo, a name lost to the walls. The figure loomed closer, and Jack realized with a sickening clarity that it was already too late. Jack's breath hitched in his throat, each breath a struggle as the cold, unnatural, bone deep, swept through him. The figure in front of him shifted, its long, bony fingers hovering just inches from his face, the touch cold enough to make his skin crawl. His heart pounded in his chest, a desperate, frantic rhythm that made his entire body tremble. The shadows in the room seemed to twist around him, pulling at the edges of his vision like dark tendrils, reaching for him, drawing him deeper into the darkness. He was drowning, suffocating. It was too much. His mind was spinning, racing with the hopeless knowledge that there was no escape from this place. The walls seemed to pulse with a low hum, vibrating under the pressure of something far older and far more powerful than he could understand. He could feel it in his bones. This house, it wasn't just a structure, it was something else, a living, breathing thing, hungry and twisted. You're one of us now. The voice echoed in his mind again, louder this time, colder. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body wouldn't move. It felt as if his limbs were made of stone, trapped in place by some invisible force. The figure's face, or what remained of it, leaned closer, the empty eye sockets fixed on him with an intensity that made his stomach turn. Jack's mind reeled with the horror of it all, the realization that he was just another piece in the house's grotesque collection. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. He could already see the others in his mind, those huddled shapes in the corner, the faces blurred and distorted, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their souls lost to this place. They were all waiting, all watching him, waiting for him to join them in the walls. There's no escape. It was then that Jack's gaze fell to the floor beneath him. The ground was shifting, warping, the dark wood of the floorboards buckling upward, as if something was crawling beneath the surface, something that wanted out. His pulse quickened, and he had to fight the rising nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. His hands moved instinctively to the floor, trying to push himself up, but the cold seemed to seep into him, draining his strength, numbing his limbs. His body screamed in protest, but he couldn't hear his own thoughts anymore. They're waiting for you. He had to get out. He had to leave. There had to be a way. But his mind was clouded with the weight of the house's curse, its relentless hunger pressing down on him. He couldn't remember how long he had been here, how long he had been trapped in this suffocating nightmare. It felt like hours, days, maybe longer. Time had become irrelevant, warped like everything else in this house. The figure loomed over him, and Jack's eyes darted desperately around the room. The flashlight, his only connection to the outside world, lay a few feet away, its faint light flickering like a dying star. He needed it. He had to reach it. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt like rubber, but he didn't care. He staggered toward the flashlight, his body protesting every movement, but he forced himself onward. The figure didn't move. It just watched, its cold, empty gaze drilling into him, its presence suffocating. He grabbed the flashlight, his hand shaking so badly that he could barely hold on to it. The light flickered once, twice, then steadied, casting a dim beam into the darkness. Jack's breath hitched as he turned the light back toward the corner where the figure had been. The shadows were gone. He didn't know what that meant, but it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The room was still, deathly still. The air had thickened, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. He had to leave, but then, as if summoned by his own fear, the air shifted. A low creaking sound echoed from somewhere above him, followed by a soft, scraping noise. It was coming from the walls. No, not the walls. Inside the walls. He felt it then, a tremor beneath his feet, like something was shifting within the house itself, moving in the hidden spaces beneath the rotting floors. Jack spun around, his breath catching in his throat. There, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam, was something he hadn't noticed before. A doorway, hidden in the corner of the room, a narrow passageway that led down deeper into the earth. The wood around it was old, splintered, and covered in a thick layer of grime, but there was something about it, something compelling, pulling him toward it. It was almost like the house was offering him an escape. But Jack wasn't foolish enough to believe that. He was already trapped. The price of escape. The whisper echoed through the room again, sharper this time. The price. Jack's throat tightened, his pulse racing as the words slithered through his thoughts. He didn't know what it meant, but he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The house wanted something from him. It always did. The door was an invitation, but not one he should trust. It was a trap, a way to bring in more souls, more bodies to add to the collection. He could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest, like invisible chains tightening around his heart. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't. But the doorway beckoned, the darkness inside it pulling him in like a vortex. He turned away from it, refusing to take another step toward the unknown. The walls were shifting again, the floor beneath him groaning as if in pain. But Jack didn't look back. He couldn't. The house was alive, hungry, and it wanted him. The more he resisted, the tighter its grip would become. Then the whisper came again, softer now, almost tender in its menace. It's already too late. Jack froze. The words sank into him like cold steel, slicing through his resolve. He had come so far, and now he was staring at the price of his curiosity. There was no escape from this house, not without giving up something, not without giving someone up. The floor beneath him buckled. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the walls, his eyes wild with panic. The shadows shifted again, and when he looked up, the figure was standing in the doorway. Not just the one from earlier. There were others now, all of them watching, their hollow faces empty but full of terrible expectation. They had been waiting for him, waiting for the moment when he would realize the truth that there was no way out, not without replacing someone. Jack's blood ran cold as the realization sank in. He wasn't meant to leave this house, not alive anyway. He was here for a reason. He had always been meant to be here, just like the others who had come before him. And now, the house was claiming him. The room felt tighter now, as if the walls themselves were inching closer, drawn in by the gravity of Jack's realization. His body was trembling, not from cold anymore, but from something deeper, something primal that clawed at his insides. A raw and jagged terror he couldn't shake. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as if the house was inhaling with him, waiting for him to make the next move. The figures, shapes, in the doorway were still, frozen in time, their hollow faces staring at him with cold, unblinking eyes. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to obey him. The room pressed against him, and the only sound was the relentless hum of the house, vibrating through the floorboards and into his bones. It's already too late. The whisper filled the room again, sharp and insistent. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The cold realization that had been creeping over him finally sank in like a weight pressing down on his chest. He wasn't meant to leave. Not alive. Not as himself. This house didn't just trap its victims physically. It possessed them, slowly peeling away their identities and replacing them with hollow shells, with memories lost and faces forgotten. And he had always been meant to be here, One more name lost to the walls, one more face on the photographs. The figures in the doorway didn't move. They just stood there, watching him, waiting. Their presence was suffocating, like 1,000 pairs of eyes, all watching, all waiting for him to make the choice. The price. Jack turned back to the passageway, the narrow door that beckoned him with its promise of escape. But he knew. He knew now. The house had a hunger that could never be sated. It fed on souls, on lives, on the very essence of those foolish enough to wander too close. And once you entered its walls, it didn't let go. It didn't want to let go. It needed something in return. It always did. His mind spun, the house closing in on him. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. And beneath that, something older, something far darker. A scent of blood and decay that made his stomach lurch. The figures, those twisted, hollow shapes, were still standing there, but Jack couldn't look at them anymore. He could feel them now, closer than ever, their presence crawling under his skin. They were part of the walls. They were part of this place. They had been claimed long ago. Their souls were now twisted into the fabric of the house. Their bodies part of the dark, living maze that stretched deep into the earth. And there was only one way out. Replace. The word echoed in his mind like a death knell. It wasn't a choice. It was a bargain. A pact made in the shadows of the house's cursed heart. The price of escape was always the same. It was always someone else's soul. He was no longer sure what was his own. Was the boy in the photographs ever truly real? Was his name ever his own? His memories felt fractured, pieces slipping through his fingers like sand. Maybe he had always been a part of this house, just another lost soul, waiting for the right moment to come to the surface. Jack stepped back, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It would be so easy to surrender, so easy to let go, to become part of the walls, to join the others in the dark. But there was a part of him, a small part, a fragile part, that refused to let go, that refused to become one of them. The figure in the doorway tilted its head, as if it could read his thoughts, as if it knew the struggle raging inside him. The empty face stared back, a grotesque mockery of something human, but with no eyes to see, no mouth to speak. The figure stepped forward, and for the briefest moment, Jack thought he saw it smile. That's when the ground beneath him cracked. The air turned bitter, sharp like a knife. The walls groaned, the house itself protesting the intrusion, its breath rattling through the rotting beams. Jack stumbled, caught off guard, his feet sliding on the uneven floor as he fought to stay upright. The passageway, the way out, was closing in, the door shrinking, becoming less of an option and more of a trap. You can't leave. The voice came from everywhere now, no longer a whisper, but a deep, guttural sound that filled his head, drowning out his thoughts. The house was alive. It was talking to him, and it was telling him something he had known all along, something he had only refused to believe. There was no escape, not for him, not for anyone. The walls pressed closer, and Jack could hear the scraping noise again, the sound of something or someone moving behind the walls. The noise was louder now, closer, like 1,000 unseen hands reaching for him, pulling him toward the center of the house, where the darkness was thick enough to drown in. The figures in the doorway were no longer still. They were moving. Slowly but inexorably, they advanced toward him. Their limbs were elongated, twisted, stretching unnaturally, as if the very fabric of reality couldn't hold them together. They were coming for him, and there was no place to hide. But as they drew nearer, something strange happened. The house itself seemed to groan, as though it were in pain, as if it didn't want to lose him yet. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath his feet shifted again, sending Jack sprawling forward. He caught himself, his hands slamming into the cold, splintered wood. His fingers brushed something soft, and when he looked down, his stomach twisted. It was a face mutilated and twisted, pinned to the wall, eyes wide and unblinking. And yet, Jack knew this face. He recognized it. It was his own. The walls were alive. The house didn't just take you. It kept you. It kept you inside, and it made you part of it. Jack's pulse quickened as the air grew thicker. He had to move. He had to do something, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't stand. He couldn't move. The walls closed in on him, and the figures reached out, their long, jagged fingers brushing against his skin. Jack gasped. The house had already claimed him. The price had already been paid, and he was already part of it. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the sound of the walls, humming, alive, hungry, waiting for the next one to step inside. It had been one of those nights, the kind where the sky was heavy, swollen with rain, and the air hung thick with the smell of damp earth. Inside, the laughter of friends and family filled the house, their voices mingling with the clinking of glasses, the crackling of the fire in the hearth, and the comforting hum of conversation. It was a scene of simple domestic joy, the kind of evening that made you feel good about life. No one suspected that things were about to change, that, in fact, everything was about to unravel. Olivia and Mark had been planning this dinner party for weeks. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a gathering of close friends and family. A few bottles of wine, some homemade dishes passed around like they'd done countless times before. The house was warm, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. There was a comfort in the familiar faces around the table, a rhythm in the night that gave everything a sense of predictability. It was a moment suspended in time, one that you could believe would go on forever. The evening had started out innocently enough. The laughter was light, and the food was good. No one had anything particularly remarkable to say, just the usual stories, the occasional joke, and the effortless banter that defined long-standing friendships. It was the kind of gathering you didn't want to end, a perfect night where everything felt right. Mark had just finished telling a story about his recent trip to the lake when the knock at the door came. It was strange the way the knock sounded. It was loud enough to cut through the clamor of the room, but it was also unsettlingly sharp, as if it belonged to someone who didn't know how to make themselves heard in the usual way. At first, no one noticed. It wasn't until Olivia glanced toward the door that she realized it had stopped everyone in their tracks. It wasn't that there had been an ominous pause, per se. It was more that everyone seemed to feel the shift at the same time. The laughter died. The conversation halted. Even the clinking of glass stopped. There was a strange stillness that seemed to settle over the room, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Mark excused himself from the table, a slightly nervous smile on his face. He wasn't one to jump at things. He never had been. But there was something about this knock. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was the way the wind had started picking up. Maybe it was the strange, inexplicable feeling that had started to take root in the back of his mind. He stood, stretched, and made his way toward the door. The rain was coming down in sheets when Mark opened it. He hadn't seen the man standing there until the door swung wide. For a moment, all he could make out was the silhouette of a figure in the downpour, drenched to the bone, his clothes clinging to his skin like something out of a nightmare. Mark didn't know why, but something about the man felt wrong. The stranger stood on the doorstep, dripping wet, his eyes hidden behind the thick rain. He was tall, thin, almost gaunt. His clothes were dark, worn, and frayed around the edges, as if he'd been traveling for a long time. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, and his expression was unreadable, distant, as if he were waiting for something to happen. Mark hesitated. "Yes?" he asked, his voice tentative, unsure. The man tilted his head, as though he were listening for something behind Mark, a sound in the distance, but there was nothing but the relentless hum of rain. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low but clear, like the sound of gravel scraping underfoot. "I'm sorry to intrude," the stranger said, his voice smooth but edged with something that Mark couldn't quite place. "But I was invited." Mark blinked, momentarily thrown off. Invited? By who? The man looked past him, staring through the open door at the warm light spilling from the house. The kind of light that made you feel welcome, safe. Mark noticed then that the man didn't seem cold. He should have been, drenched as he was. But there was no shiver, no sign that the man was uncomfortable in any way. He simply stood there, motionless, waiting for Mark to respond. "I'm afraid I don't remember sending you an invitation," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. His instincts told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't quite pin it down. The stranger's lips curled into a faint smile. "Oh, but I'm sure you did. Maybe you just don't remember. It's a busy time, isn't it?" Mark glanced over his shoulder, wondering if anyone else had heard the conversation. The room was quiet behind him, but there was a growing tension in the air, an uneasy feeling that had crept in with the stranger's presence. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the kindness in the man's voice, the subtle pressure in his words, or the fact that they were already standing there in the doorway, in the rain. But for whatever reason, Mark stepped aside and allowed the stranger to enter. "I'll make sure you're comfortable," Mark muttered, but the man didn't seem to hear him. He was already moving toward the living room, his footsteps quiet but certain. Mark shut the door, locking it behind him, and turned back to the table. Olivia was watching him, her face etched with concern. The guests were exchanging glances, murmuring in low voices. No one had recognized the man, not one of them. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of the room, as though he belonged. The man didn't seem to notice the unease he'd stirred. He took a seat in the corner, almost as if it were his rightful place, and the others followed his lead, going back to their drinks, their conversations, the usual rhythm of the evening. But it wasn't the same, not anymore. The man was unsettling in the most subtle way. There was something in his presence that made the room feel tighter, colder. Every so often, Mark would catch the man's eyes across the room, dark, fathomless eyes that seemed to pierce through him, seeing things he wasn't sure he wanted anyone to see. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The man didn't say much at first. He just sat there, a drink in his hand, his gaze sweeping over everyone, like he was cataloging each person in the room, studying them in silence. But soon it began. His questions, his remarks, the things he knew. At first, it was subtle. A comment about how the salmon tasted exactly like Olivia's grandmother's recipe, despite Olivia having never mentioned it. Then the stranger referred to Mark's old car, the one he'd sold years ago. But Mark had never mentioned it to anyone. The others hadn't noticed yet, but Mark felt the temperature in the room drop. He felt the air growing thicker, heavier. As the minutes stretched on, things began to change. The laughter that had once filled the room faded, replaced by a low, uneasy murmur. Conversations faltered, and the gaze of the man in the corner grew more intense, more focused. It was as though everyone was suddenly aware of a presence that hadn't been there before. The man knew things no one should know. The kind of things you only tell your closest friends, or sometimes no one at all. And that's when Mark felt the first prickle of real fear, because as the evening wore on, it became clear that this stranger wasn't just someone who'd stumbled in by accident. He wasn't just a mysterious guest. He was something else, and he wasn't leaving. The moment Mark sat back down at the table, something shifted in the room. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a subtle change, like the air pressure in the room had dropped. A coldness, but not the kind that made you shiver. It was deeper, more suffocating, like something pressing on your chest, making it harder to breathe. The laughter that had once been so easy had already started to thin out, leaving behind awkward silences. No one seemed to know what to say, or if they should say anything at all. The stranger was still sitting in his corner, but now there was something other about him. It wasn't just his unsettling stillness, or the way his dark eyes seemed to track every person in the room. It was his presence, the way it seemed to grow, to fill the space in a way that felt wrong, like a shadow creeping across the walls. No one had really asked him to stay, but here he was, his legs casually crossed, his drink still in his hand, staring at them all with a quiet intensity that made Mark's skin crawl. At the far end of the table, Jacob, one of Mark's oldest friends, cleared his throat uncomfortably. He was the first one to try to break the silence, his voice wavering slightly. "So, how do you know Mark and Olivia then?" he asked, a nervous chuckle escaping his throat. "I mean, we don't remember sending you an invitation." The stranger didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned his head slowly, as if savoring the question. Then, his lips curled into that unsettling smile again. "Invitations are funny things," the stranger said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, like a well-rehearsed line from a play. "You might not always remember sending them. Sometimes you send them without knowing you've done it." There was a pause, long enough for the unease in the room to deepen. "But I know you all, don't I?" The stranger's voice dropped lower now, as though speaking to each person individually, though he was still looking at everyone with those cold, unblinking eyes. "I know you, Jacob, with your late-night drives out to the edge of town, hoping nobody notices. And you, Claire, your secret meetings in the park. No one talks about them, but I know." Claire, sitting across from Jacob, stiffened at the mention of her name. She glanced nervously at Jacob, but before either of them could react, the The stranger turned his gaze to the next person. "And you, Mark," the stranger said softly, as though sharing an intimate secret. "I know the little things you don't say out loud, the things you try to bury in the back of your mind. It's funny how you can go so long pretending not to remember something." Mark felt his heart skip. His stomach twisted, as though the stranger's words had physically reached inside him and squeezed. He tried to ignore it, but he couldn't. He felt his palms growing slick with sweat. "Maybe," the stranger continued, his tone taking on a mocking quality now. "Maybe it's easier to keep things buried, but in a place like this, buried things don't stay buried for long." The words hung in the air, dense and suffocating, like the smoke from a fire you couldn't put out. Mark could feel the eyes of the room on him, but his gaze was fixed on the stranger, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, just stared back with those unrelenting eyes. For a long moment, it was as if time itself had paused. It was Olivia who broke the silence, her voice tight but steady. "Who are you?" she asked, her words clipped, demanding. She wasn't sure if she was speaking out of fear or anger. She didn't know this man, and every instinct in her told her that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The stranger's smile deepened, just slightly, like he had been waiting for her to ask. "You already know me, Olivia. I've always been here, waiting for you." His voice was soft now, almost gentle, but there was a chilling undertone that made Olivia's blood run cold. Mark shot a glance at Olivia, who was staring at the stranger as if trying to make sense of him, trying to piece together what he was saying. He couldn't do it, no matter how hard he tried. There was something in this man's presence, something in his knowing, that unraveled the very fabric of what should have been a comfortable, friendly evening. There was a knock at the door, faint but insistent, a soft thudding that sliced through the tension in the room like a knife. Mark's eyes darted to the door, but when he stood up to check, the stranger held up a hand, stopping him. "It's not for you," the stranger said simply, his voice barely a whisper, though it carried across the room with unsettling clarity. Mark froze. The knock came again, louder this time, and with it, another shift in the atmosphere, like the house itself was tightening, its walls closing in. Something was very wrong, and Mark could feel it now with every fiber of his being. This was no ordinary guest. This man didn't belong here, and yet he had slipped past the threshold of their lives, had found his way into their most private space, and now Mark could feel the shadow of his presence growing, like it was spreading across the room, smothering the light, replacing the warmth with cold. "We should go check the door," Claire muttered, her voice trembling. She had been trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that had started to gnaw at her insides, but now her fear was too strong to hide. She pushed her chair back and stood up, glancing nervously at the man in the corner. "We can't just leave someone out there in the rain." "No," the stranger said, his voice suddenly sharp, like the snap of a broken branch. "You're already here. All of you are already here. The door is just a distraction." A chill ran through the room, and Claire's hand froze on the back of her chair. It was as if the stranger's words had rooted her to the spot. Mark, too, felt paralyzed, as if his feet were glued to the floor. "I told you," the stranger continued, his voice lowering to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "I've been invited. I've been waiting." There was a long pause, one that stretched taut. the silence vibrating with a suffocating weight. "You've all been waiting too," the stranger added softly, almost like a confession. Olivia shook her head, trying to make sense of it. She felt something deep inside her snap, a breaking point that she couldn't understand. She wanted to yell at him, to demand an explanation, but the words stuck in her throat. Everything she wanted to say felt wrong, as if it would only feed into whatever was happening. The stranger's voice dropped lower, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Mark," the stranger whispered, "there's something you've been hiding, something that you've kept from all of them." He leaned forward, and suddenly the air was thick with an energy Mark couldn't explain. "And I'm not leaving until you admit it." The weight of the stranger's words hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating and unyielding. Mark felt the room close in around him, each breath becoming harder to take, the very air growing thick with dread. The stranger's cold, emotionless gaze had shifted from Olivia to him, pinning him in place with the same unsettling intensity. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. "You've been waiting too," the stranger had said, his voice an insidious whisper. Mark could feel his insides coil in on themselves, the sensation like the tightening of a noose. His heart pounded erratically in his chest. There were no answers here, no easy way out. The stranger knew something he shouldn't, something Mark couldn't escape. The truth that had stayed buried, locked deep in the recesses of his mind, was about to claw its way to the surface. For a moment, everything was quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed in on you, wrapping itself around your chest, until it felt as though you were drowning in it. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that seemed to shift and twitch as if they had a life of their own. And in the corner of the room, the stranger waited, as still as death itself, his eyes never leaving Mark's face. "What do you want from me?" Mark managed to choke out, his voice cracking. He didn't recognize it, didn't even know where the words had come from. There was no anger in them, no fight, only terror. The terror of being exposed. The stranger didn't respond right away. He simply took a sip of his drink, savoring it, his eyes still fixed on Mark. It was as though he was letting the silence stretch out, letting Mark feel the full weight of his gaze. "From you?" The stranger's voice was soft now, almost tender, as if he were speaking to a child. "I want nothing, really. Nothing but the truth." Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Truth. That was the thing he feared most. Not lies, not deceit, but truth. Truth was a weapon, a thing that could break people wide open, leaving them raw and exposed, incapable of hiding anything. And he had been hiding something for years, something so ugly, so awful, that he had tried with all his might to forget it. But now, here it was, waiting to be revealed. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching longer and longer across the walls. Mark could feel the weight of his friend's eyes on him, but he couldn't look at them. His gaze was locked on the stranger, who hadn't moved an inch. He wasn't even blinking. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for Mark to say the words, to confess whatever it was that had been buried deep inside him for so long. Olivia, sitting next to Mark, reached out and touched his arm. Her fingers were cold, and her touch was almost too gentle. It was as if she were trying to reach him through the thick fog of panic that had descended over him. "Mark, please." Her voice trembled slightly. "What's going on? What does he want?" But Mark couldn't speak. The words felt stuck in his throat, caught behind the dam of fear that had built up inside him. He wanted to tell her everything, to scream out what he had done, but there was nothing to say. How could he explain the truth when even he didn't understand it anymore? How could he admit to something so monstrous? The stranger leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His smile was small, satisfied. He had Mark exactly where he wanted him. The silence stretched between them like a rope, and Mark could feel the tension in the room tightening, constricting. "You don't have to say it, Mark," the stranger said, his voice so soft it almost sounded like a lullaby. "Not yet anyway, but you will. You all will." The last part of his sentence sent a shiver up Mark's spine. "All of us?" The stranger chuckled. It was a quiet sound, like dry leaves scraping across stone, but it sent a jolt through the room. Everyone looked at each other, exchanging uncertain glances. No one knew what he meant, but the fear was palpable now, creeping into every corner, suffocating them. "I know you, Olivia," the stranger said suddenly, his attention shifting back to her. Mark felt the air shift again as the stranger's gaze fell on his wife. The smile on his face widened, and Mark felt something cold stir in his gut. "Your grandmother's old house, right?" The stranger's voice was smooth, coaxing, as if he were asking a harmless question. "The one you've kept locked up for years. You've never told anyone what's really in the attic, have you?" Olivia's face drained of color. Her hand, still resting on Mark's arm, stiffened. She recoiled slightly, her eyes darting to Mark, as if silently asking him to make this go away. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the stranger only smiled, as though he'd been expecting this answer. "Of course you don't," he said with eerie calmness. "It's been so long, hasn't it? The things we bury, the things we think we've forgotten." His gaze flickered back to Mark, then to Jacob, then Claire. His eyes moved across the room like a predator scanning its prey. "I'll make this simple," he continued. "Everyone has something they've buried. Everyone in this room has a secret, a dark secret, and I'm not leaving until you all admit it." The stranger's words, simple as they sounded, hit like a hammer. Mark's throat tightened. The others were looking at one another, but none of them said anything. Olivia was staring at the stranger now, her face pale, a mix of fear and disbelief on her features. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Jacob stood up suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "What the hell do you want from us?" he spat, but his voice wavered. There was no confidence in his tone, no strength. His bravado was a paper-thin mask, and it was cracking in real time. The others remained silent, their eyes fixed on the stranger. "I don't want anything," the stranger said, his voice low and melodic, almost soothing. "I'm just here to make sure you remember, to make sure you face the things you've hidden. You don't get to forget what you've done. Not anymore." Mark felt as if he were suffocating. There was no escape from the truth. There was nowhere to run. But as the words left the stranger's mouth, Mark's eyes flickered to the door, and for the briefest moment, he thought he heard something. A sound, a whispering, soft but urgent, as though it were coming from the other side of the house. Something, or someone, was trying to get in. And that thought, that one solitary whisper, made Mark's stomach drop. because in that moment, he realized there was more to the story than the stranger's revelations. The house itself was no longer just a setting. It was part of this twisted game, and there was something much, much darker waiting for them. The whisper at the door persisted, faint at first, but then growing louder, more insistent, like fingers scraping against the wood. It wasn't the rain that made the sound, Mark realized, not the wind, not the house settling. No, it was something, someone, trying to get in. Something that had been waiting, just out of sight, its presence as palpable as the stranger himself. The hair on the back of Mark's neck prickled, and he glanced around the room. The others had heard it too. Olivia was the first to move, slowly standing up from the table, her face pale as death itself. She didn't look at Mark. She couldn't. Her eyes were glued to the door, wide and unblinking. The sound had become almost rhythmic now, a steady knock that wasn't quite a knock. It was a scratching, like nails against the wood, desperate, impatient. "Do you hear that?" Olivia's voice was shaking, her breath coming too fast. She backed away from the table, hands clasped tightly in front of her as if to hold herself together. "It's..." She stopped, as though the words had lodged themselves in her throat. The others were staring, their faces twisted in confusion and fear. They all heard it, but no one moved. "Answer it," the stranger said quietly, his tone unfazed. It was as if the knocking didn't disturb him at all. Perhaps it never had. His voice was low and almost calming, yet it made Mark's skin crawl. The stranger sat back in his chair, casual and serene, as if he were watching an event unfold rather than being a part of it. Mark's hands clenched into fists, the tension in the room making his teeth grind. "I don't know what you want from us," he said, his voice a low growl. "We haven't done anything to you." The stranger's smile deepened, just a fraction. He didn't move, didn't react to the fear swirling in the room. Instead, his eyes locked onto Mark's, and for the first time, Mark felt the suffocating weight of what this man was. Not just a guest. No, this man wasn't a guest at all. He was something else entirely, something ancient and terrible, wrapped in the guise of a stranger. "You've done plenty," the stranger said softly. "You've all done plenty." He didn't speak to Mark alone now. His gaze swept across the room, touching each of the guests in turn, lingering on them just long enough for them to squirm under the weight of his attention. The knocking at the door was relentless, a rhythmic pounding now that echoed through the house. Mark felt the walls of the room close in, and his heart hammered in his chest like a drum, each beat a reminder of how trapped they were. This was no longer just a dinner party. This was a cage, and they were all caught in it. "Olivia," the stranger said, his voice suddenly soft and coaxing, as if trying to comfort her. "You're afraid of what's behind that door, aren't you? Afraid that something you've locked away will come spilling out." Olivia's hands shook, her fingers twitching as if they were about to collapse under the pressure of the words she couldn't say. Her gaze flickered between the door and the stranger, who was watching her like a hawk. Mark could see the way her eyes darted, the way her breath quickened. She was terrified, not of the stranger, but of something else, something that had been haunting her for years. "What's behind that door, Olivia?" The stranger's question was like a caress, smooth and predatory. "Do you think you can leave it locked forever?" Mark's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, to stop this madness, but his throat was dry. and his words felt like they would break apart before they reached his lips. "Don't listen to him," Mark finally forced out, but even to his own ears, his voice sounded small, weak. "He's playing games with us." But Olivia didn't answer. Instead, she moved toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate, each one heavier than the last. She was afraid. Mark could see that much. But there was something else, too. A curiosity. Something darkly magnetic that seemed to draw her toward the door. "You know, you have to open it," the stranger murmured. "The door has to be opened. It's the only way." Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. The stranger's words were like a curse, a compulsion that was tugging at Olivia, pulling her toward the door as if it were a magnet. And to his horror, she reached for the handle. The rest of the room watched in silence, but none of them moved. Jacob's face was frozen in a mask of disbelief. Claire was biting her nails nervously, and even the stranger seemed to be waiting with bated breath. Olivia's hand hovered above the door handle for a long moment. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. She turned the knob, and the door creaked open. Just a crack, enough to let the darkness outside slip in like a tide. For a moment, Mark thought he saw something beyond the door, just out of view. A shape, long and stretching, dark and formless, like the shadow of something that had no business existing. His heart leaped into his throat, but before he could react, the door swung open wider. The wind gusted inside, a chill sweeping across the room, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and decay. The shadows beyond seemed to deepen, moving like they were alive. And then it hit him. The smell. It wasn't just damp earth or wet leaves. It was something older, something foul. It was the smell of rot, of decay. Olivia stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still resting on the handle, her face pale as she stared into the abyss outside. Mark could feel his heart beating in his throat as he stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab her, to pull her back, but something stopped him. The stranger's voice came, soft and insistent. "Do you feel it? The truth?" Mark turned to him, his mouth dry. "What truth?" he asked hoarsely. The stranger smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "The truth you've been hiding from," he said, his voice low, nearly a whisper. "The truth of the thing you thought you could escape." Before Mark could even respond, Olivia stepped forward, her foot crossing the threshold of the door, disappearing into the darkness outside. "Olivia!" Mark shouted, rushing forward, but the stranger's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. "No," the stranger said, his grip cold and unyielding. "She has to face it, just like all of you." Mark pulled at the stranger's grip, but it was like trying to break free from iron. The stranger held him in place, his smile never fading. And then Mark heard it, the sound of movement outside, something scraping against the earth, crawling toward them. The shadows moved again, and Mark could hear the faintest whispering from the blackness beyond the door. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, each beat sounding like a drum, echoing through his skull. His eyes locked onto the door, but the shadows beyond it, shifting, crawling like living things, had swallowed Olivia whole. Her footsteps, once hesitant, had become a strange, drawn-out rhythm. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though the very fabric of the house had been altered by her step into the unknown. "Olivia!" Mark shouted again, his voice breaking. He wrenched his arm out of the stranger's grip, his nails digging into the man's cold hand, But it was useless. The stranger didn't even flinch. "I told you," the stranger murmured softly, as though speaking to a child. "She has to face it. They all have to face it." Mark whirled toward him, his breath ragged, wild. "What the hell is it? What are you doing to us?" The stranger only smiled, that same empty, knowing smile. His eyes never left the door. "You're already too late. All of you." The darkness behind the door seemed to stretch further, as though it were alive, growing, pulling in more of the room, more of the house itself. Mark could feel the air in the room shift, grow heavier, as if the walls were pressing in, suffocating him. The whispering outside the door was louder now, a constant, low hum that gnawed at his sanity. He had to act. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not like this. Mark dashed forward, pushing past the stranger with a strength he didn't know he had. The house seemed to fight him every step of the way, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet as if they were trying to hold him back. He reached the door and slammed his hand against the frame, his eyes wild as he peered into the abyss beyond. Olivia was standing there, but she wasn't moving. She was frozen, staring at something that Mark couldn't see. Something terrible. Her mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were wide with horror, staring at something only she could perceive. "Olivia," Mark called, his voice rising in desperation. He stepped toward her, but the air around him thickened, and for the briefest moment, he felt as though something was holding him back, something unseen, like a weight, a pressure, keeping him from moving. "Olivia, please, come back," he begged, his voice cracking, but she didn't respond. Her expression was vacant, empty, as if she were already lost. Mark reached for her, his fingertips brushing her shoulder, but the moment his skin made contact, he felt it. A shock of cold so intense, it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. He yanked his hand back as though burned, his pulse racing. "Get away from her." The stranger's voice was now an icy command, cutting through the fog of fear like a knife. Mark spun around, but the stranger had moved. He was standing in the doorway, blocking Mark's path, his eyes glittering with something else, something unholy. "I told you," the stranger said, his voice softer now, like the final note of a song. "She has to face it. She will. She can't escape what she's done any more than you can escape yours." Mark's throat constricted. The weight of those words hung in the air like a guillotine blade, and for a moment Mark's thoughts scrambled, desperate for understanding, desperate for anything that would explain this nightmare. "What is it?" Mark managed, his voice trembling. "What's out there? What's happened to her?" The stranger's eyes narrowed, just a touch, and then he smiled again. A cold, mirthless smile that chilled Mark to his core. "The truth is simple," the stranger said, almost lazily. "You've all been hiding something, every single one of you. That's why you're here, why I'm here. You asked for this. You invited it without even realizing. You sealed your fate the moment you walked through the door." Mark's mind raced. What did that mean? His chest felt tight, as though the air itself had become too thick to breathe. The stranger wasn't just talking about the others. He was talking about Mark, about Olivia, about them all. "What do you mean? I didn't..." Mark's voice broke off as he stared at the stranger, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was hearing. But the words seemed to slip through his fingers, like sand through an open palm. "You know what I mean," the stranger said. voice dropping lower, filled with something ancient, something powerful. You've been hiding something so dark, so terrible, that not even you can look at it, but you're going to have to. You'll face it, just like everyone else. Mark's head spun. His legs were suddenly weak beneath him, his vision beginning to swim as he fought against the overwhelming sense of wrongness that saturated the air. The knocking had stopped, but the whispers, soft, slithering whispers, had grown louder. His eyes flicked back to Olivia. She was still standing motionless, her gaze locked on the shadows beyond the door, her face pale, drained of all color. He reached out again, but the moment his hand grazed her arm, something cold and jagged rippled through him, a shockwave that seemed to sink into his very bones. The stranger's voice echoed through his skull. Do you want to know what's waiting for her? What's waiting for you? Mark's heart skipped a beat. He tried to pull his hand away from Olivia, but it wouldn't move. It was as though his hand was stuck, frozen to her like an anchor in the dark. Panic surged through him, and he yanked harder, but it was no use. He was tethered to her, bound to the door, caught in the web that had been spun long before he even walked into this house. The stranger stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with something twisted. You don't have to speak it aloud, he whispered, as if reading Mark's mind. But you know what you did, don't you? The thing you tried to bury, the thing you thought you could run from. Mark's stomach churned, and his breath came in ragged gasps. His chest tightened painfully, the air around him becoming suffocating, crushing him beneath its weight. The thing I thought I could run from. The truth hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him in a wave of nausea and horror. He had been running from it for years. He had buried it deep down, hoping it would never see the light of day, hoping that if he pretended it didn't exist, it would vanish. But it was still here. It had always been here. The stranger's smile grew wider. There it is, he said softly, as if Mark had finally said the words aloud. The truth. And with that, Mark felt the world shift beneath him. The house, no, the world began to distort, the edges of reality blurring and melting like wax under a flame. The darkness beyond the door reached in, pulling them all into its embrace. Mark opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the shadows. And then, nothing. When Rowan Donovan first moved to Pinebrook, she had no way of knowing how the town's heart, its very pulse, was out of sync. The sleepy little town nestled between two low mountain ridges, cradled by the kind of quiet you can only find in a place where time seems to slow down. But even in a town where nothing much happens, there are oddities. The clock tower, for one. It was an old thing, a relic from the town's founding, rising above the streets like a sentry on watch. People in Pinebrook had long stopped paying attention to the way it struck at midnight, but Rowan noticed it immediately. The first time she heard it, she was unpacking boxes in her new apartment above the bakery. She'd only been there a few hours, and the sound of the bells startled her. At first, she thought it was just an odd coincidence that the clock had malfunctioned, but then she heard it again the next night. 13 chimes at midnight. Rowan shook her head, trying to brush off the strangeness of it. It was just a glitch, surely. Old clocks did that sometimes, right? They lost track of time. They malfunctioned. She didn't think much of it beyond that. But then the next night, it happened again. The 13th. She counted them in her head, each one ringing out from the clock tower, one after another. 1, 3, up to 12, and then another, a 13th chime. That was when she first noticed something was off. The streets outside her window were eerily still. No cars, no people, not even a dog barking. Just nothing. It wasn't exactly odd, but there was something about it that felt unsettling, as if the world around her was holding its breath. The sound of the chimes, each one ringing out, seemed to stretch the seconds, making them longer, like they were somehow bleeding into one another. She looked out her window. The moon hung high above the town, casting long, sharp shadows down the main street. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal, even if it wasn't. Rowan decided to go down and get a late-night snack from the bakery below. It was just a little after midnight, and she'd gotten used to the bakery's smell of fresh bread and pastries. The air felt thick, though, dense almost. She shook her head as if trying to shake off a bad dream, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her as she made her way down the stairs. When she opened the bakery door, a strange wave of cold hit her. Her breath fogged in the air for a moment before she stepped outside. She hadn't expected the chill, but the night was still, and the moonlight bounced off the cobblestone streets like silver dust. The bakery's warm lights were the only thing that seemed to fight off the darkness. And the quiet, it was too quiet. Nothing stirred. No sound except the faint rustling of the wind through the trees in the town square. She made her way over to the counter, absent-mindedly picking up a loaf of sourdough bread and a small jar of jam. As she turned back toward the door, something caught her eye. There, in the town square, she saw a man standing beneath the clock tower. He wasn't facing her, but she knew he was there. She didn't recognize him. He was wearing an old coat that seemed to be made of thick, dark wool, the kind of coat that would have been worn 100 years ago. A long scarf wrapped around his neck. He stood perfectly still, staring up at the clock as if waiting for something. Rowan felt a chill race down her spine. She had heard stories from the locals, the kind of stories people tell when they want to spook newcomers, but she never believed them. Not really. Ghost stories, myths about things that happened before anyone could remember. The clock, the chimes at midnight. People said it was cursed, that it marked something bad happening every time it struck 13. But Rowan didn't believe in any of that. Not really. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that crept over her as she watched the figure by the clock. She wanted to call out to him, to ask if he was all right, but the words caught in her throat. The stillness of the night pressed in on her, like the weight of something unseen. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He began to walk slowly, deliberately, and as he passed beneath the flickering lamplight, Rowan saw the cold, expressionless look on his face. He didn't seem like a man in a hurry. She stepped out from the bakery, her hand brushing the door as she watched him disappear down the street. She felt herself shiver again, but this time it wasn't just the cold. There was something else, something deeper, gnawing at her gut. It was like an instinct she couldn't shake, a feeling that something wasn't right. She hurried back upstairs to her apartment, locking the door behind her. But no matter how much she tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, the feeling stayed with her. The clock tower, the man, the cold air, everything felt too quiet, too still. And at the back of her mind, there was that strange thing she couldn't ignore, The clock struck 13. The next day, Rowan decided to ask around. She hadn't meant to, but after the strange encounter with the man by the clock tower, she felt like she had to know more. She started with Mrs. Wilkins, the elderly woman who ran the flower shop in the town square. She had been in Pine Brook longer than most, and she knew the town like the back of her hand. Mrs. Wilkins was dusting the windows when Rowan walked in. The air smelled like lavender and roses, and the shop was warm and inviting. But even in the comfort of the flowers, Rowan could feel the tension rising in her chest. She waited for Mrs. Wilkins to look up. "Good morning," Rowan said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just curious about something." Mrs. Wilkins squinted at her, raising a bushy gray eyebrow. "Curious, are you? You're a new face around here, dear. Not too many newcomers these days." Rowan nodded. "Yes, well, I've been hearing some strange things about the clock tower, about the 13th chime. Do you know anything about it?" Mrs. Wilkins stopped what she was doing, her hands freezing midair, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. Her eyes darted around, and Rowan noticed her posture stiffen, like she was bracing for something. "The 13th chime," Mrs. Wilkins repeated, her voice low. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but it's best you forget about it. The clock strikes 13, that's all. It's been like that for as long as anyone can remember." "But why?" Rowan pressed. "Why 13? What does it mean?" Mrs. Wilkins sighed and put down her dust rag. She looked up at Rowan, her expression hardening, then softened into something else, something resigned. "You'll understand soon enough, dear. Just don't go digging too deep. You may not like what you find." And with that, Rowan felt an unease settle deep into her bones. Something about Mrs. Wilkins' words had stirred up a feeling that she couldn't shake, a sense of being on the edge of something terrible, something inevitable. But Rowan wasn't the kind of person to shy away from a mystery. She was determined to find out what the 13th hour really meant, what it meant. The morning after her conversation with Mrs. Wilkins, Rowan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that Pine Brook wasn't just a sleepy town. It was a town stuck. The more she thought about it, the more the events of the previous night seemed unnatural, like a dream she couldn't wake from. She had no idea why she felt so pulled to the clock tower, to the 13th chime. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it clawed at her mind. It wasn't just the clock striking 13. It was the feeling that accompanied it, the stillness, the emptiness that seemed to saturate the streets. It was as if the town exhaled its breath when the chime sounded, and for that brief moment, everyone became part of something bigger, something unexplainable. Rowan found herself walking through the quiet streets of Pine Brook, the cobblestone roads winding beneath her feet, the town's stone buildings lined up like memories fading into the distance. The townspeople moved around her like ghosts, their faces pale, their eyes dim, and no one ever seemed to acknowledge her presence, as though they had all forgotten she was there. It wasn't deliberate, it wasn't malicious, it was just wrong. It was the kind of thing that you couldn't explain, but you could feel it. As she walked through the market square, her thoughts drifted back to Mrs. Wilkins. The warning. Don't dig too deep. It was a veiled threat, and Rowan didn't like being told what she could or couldn't do. She wasn't going to leave Pine Brook without answers. If the clock tower had a secret, she was going to find it. That afternoon, she decided to explore the tower itself. She made her way down Main Street, past the row of shops that seemed as though they hadn't seen a customer in years, and toward the town square. The clock tower loomed ahead, its silhouette cutting sharply against the pale sky. It was taller up close than it had seemed from her apartment window, rising like some ancient monolith, dark and looming, its stone surface worn with age. When she reached the foot of the tower, Rowan hesitated. The area around it was empty. No children running about. No tourists stopping to take pictures. It felt abandoned. The door to the tower was slightly ajar, its brass handle worn smooth from years of use, or perhaps from years of neglect. Rowan's curiosity won out, and she gently pushed the door open. The interior of the tower smelled like old wood and dust. There was an oppressive silence inside, the kind that made you feel like someone or something was watching. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing through the narrow stone hallway that led to the winding staircase. The walls of the tower were covered in faded murals, images of clocks and gears, half-finished sketches of the town's history. She couldn't help but notice how strange the murals were. Some were incomplete, others distorted, with faces twisted in unnatural ways. The deeper she walked, the more the air seemed to thicken. There was something in the stillness of the place, something that made her heart race, like the tower itself was alive, breathing. Rowan ascended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight, until she reached a small, open chamber where the great clock mechanism resided. It was magnificent in a haunting way, an enormous brass structure with gears and cogs that clicked and turned, the clock's hands frozen just past midnight. There was a dim light that filtered in through a small window, casting long shadows across the room. She approached the clock cautiously, feeling the weight of history in the air. It was like a museum piece, but there was something alive about it. The tick of the mechanism, the hum of the gears shifting and turning, seemed to vibrate in the floor beneath her. She could almost feel the pulse of the town syncing with the clock. And then, as her eyes traveled to the far corner of the room, she saw it. A small table covered with sheets of yellowed paper, old maps of Pine Brook, and something that made her stomach tighten. Photos. The pictures were pinned to the wall behind the table, each one showing something unsettling. At first, she thought they were just old town photos, faded memories of Pine Brook's early days. But as she looked closer, she realized they were pictures of the town's people, people she recognized, the baker, the school teacher, the town sheriff, all of them, but with something off about them. Their eyes were wide open in shock, their faces contorted, as though they were in the middle of some terrible moment. And most chilling of all, there was something else. In every photo, there was a shadow, a figure standing just behind them, hidden in the background. The same figure, dressed in a dark coat, a brimmed hat obscuring his face. The man from last night. Rowan's blood ran cold. She stepped back, her breath hitching in her throat as the images seemed to warp before her eyes. Something in the room felt wrong. The air was thick, heavier than before, and the clock above her, silent, seemed to hum with a life of its own, vibrating the very walls. A sound, quiet, almost inaudible at first, reached her ears. It was a whisper, faint and insistent, like the wind through a crack. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning. And then she felt it, a a sudden pressure in her chest, as if the very room had shifted around her. Time slowed. Her eyes snapped to the clock, and she saw that its hands were moving again. Slowly, impossibly slow, the minute hand clicked forward. 12, 12, 12. She glanced toward the door. The shadows in the room grew darker, shifting like liquid, pooling at the edges of the walls. The floor beneath her seemed to shudder, as though it were giving way, cracking under the weight of something that shouldn't be. A feeling of vertigo hit her. Rowan reached out, grabbing the wall to steady herself. Then the clock struck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. The sound of the 13th chime rattled the room, reverberating through Rowan's skull like a force of nature. She gripped the table, her breath caught in her throat. Everything around her seemed to bend, distort, shift. The air pulsed with a sharp crackling sound, and she felt her body lurch forward, as if the ground had suddenly disappeared beneath her feet. Her vision blurred, and then everything went dark. Rowan awoke with a jolt, gasping for air. Her surroundings had changed. The tower was still there, but it was different. The walls were closer now, the floor darker, the light from the window strange, warped, as though she were looking through a foggy lens. The photos on the wall were the same, but now their faces were contorted into expressions of agony, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent screams. And there, in the corner of the room, the shadow figure stood again, his form indistinct, his presence suffocating. Rowan's heart pounded in her chest as she realized it had happened. She was no longer in the same place. She had crossed over. She had been trapped in the 13th hour. Rowan's heart hammered against her ribcage, each pulse a frantic reminder that she was no longer in the Pinebrook she knew. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the cold floor, the sharp, unfamiliar air biting at her skin. The room had changed. No longer the familiar clock tower she had explored only moments ago, but something darker. The stone walls were slick, almost alive in their dampness, and the dim light that filtered through the window cast long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, like they were trying to crawl toward her. She had to move. The pulse of the 13th chime still echoed in her skull, a dull, rhythmic beat that seemed to reverberate from deep within the very bones of the tower. The quiet, unnerving, thick with the weight of something waiting, pressed in on her from all sides. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only suffocating emptiness in its place. She reached for the brass doorknob, her fingers cold as she gripped it, but the door didn't open. She twisted it harder, but it refused to budge. A twinge of panic slid through her like ice water, and she jerked her body back, stepping away from the door. Something wasn't right. Something's changed. Her breathing quickened, her pulse racing faster with every passing second. She had to figure out what had happened, and more importantly, how she was going to get out of this place. She stumbled over to the window, pressing her face to the cold glass. She looked out onto the town square. The moon was high, casting a pallid light over the familiar streets of Pinebrook, but something was different. The trees swayed in a motion that seemed too deliberate, as if they were watching her. The streets were empty. There were no people, no signs of life at all. Yet she could sense it, that feeling of being watched. It was like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. Rowan's gaze shifted across the square, landing on the clock tower, her clock tower, standing tall against the backdrop of an inky sky. It looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The 13th chime had shattered the delicate balance of time. She backed away from the window and turned, trying to calm her breath, trying to collect her thoughts, but it was no use. Nothing felt right. The air felt too heavy, the walls too close. The figure, the shadow she had seen in the photos, was gone, but she could still feel its presence, lingering like a stain on the air. It was as if it had never been there, but its absence made her heart race. She had to find out more. She needed answers. She headed down the stairs, her feet echoing on the stone, but the deeper she went, the more the weight of the air pressed on her. The stairs seemed to stretch farther than they should. Her mind fought the sense of vertigo that washed over her. This was a trick, a game the tower played with her. She could feel it, could almost hear it laughing, mocking her for believing she could simply leave. The clock was in control now. At the bottom of the tower, she found herself standing in the main hall. Everything was eerily still. The shadows seemed to bend around her, warping in ways they shouldn't have. It was like they were alive, reacting to her every movement. The silence weighed heavily on her. Rowan's footsteps faltered as she crossed the room toward the door. Something, a distant voice, echoed in her mind. The warning, the stories she had heard when she first arrived, the things the locals had whispered about the clock tower, about the 13th hour. The town's past seemed to be pressing in on her, an invisible hand tightening around her throat. You shouldn't have come here. The words were faint at first, a whisper that came from nowhere, yet from everywhere. It was a voice, familiar, yet impossible to place. Rowan's body went rigid, a shiver running through her. The voice was cold, like it had been buried in the earth for too long. She spun around. The room was empty. Leave. The voice was louder now, more insistent. Rowan stumbled backward, her hand reaching out for something to steady herself. Her fingers brushed against something hard, and she looked down to see a small, ornate box resting on the stone floor. It hadn't been there before. She didn't remember seeing it when she entered. The box was carved with intricate symbols, marks that she didn't recognize, strange glyphs that seemed to pulse beneath her fingers, glowing faintly in the dim light. The moment her hand touched it, the whispering stopped. The silence rushed in, suffocating. Rowan's eyes were locked on the box. Without fully understanding why, she bent down and picked it up. The weight of it in her hands felt wrong, as if it was too heavy for its size. Something about it seemed alive in a way that the clock tower wasn't. She opened the box. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a single key, a key unlike any she had ever seen. It was old, wrought from a dark metal that glinted in the dim light. Its teeth were jagged, almost unnatural, and the handle was carved into a shape that seemed to pulse with something dark, something ancient. Rowan's pulse quickened, but she couldn't bring herself to put the key down. It was like it was calling to her, pulling her closer. Suddenly, the door to the tower opened with a groan. Rowan's head snapped toward the noise, but there was no one standing in the doorway. The empty hallway stretched out before her, the shadows deep and unnerving. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced back down at the key. still warm in her hand. This is the way out, she realized, the thought hitting her like a bolt of lightning. With trembling fingers, she slid the key into the lock at the door. It turned. The door creaked open, revealing nothing. A void. The hallway outside the tower was black, like the space beyond the door led to nothingness. It was an emptiness that swallowed up sound, light, and hope. Rowan stared into it, her breath shallow, her mind screaming to run, to turn away, but she couldn't. Something on the other side of the threshold beckoned her, something dark and cold and waiting. She stepped through the door, and instantly the world shifted again. Rowan was no longer in the clock tower. The streets outside were different. The buildings were older, the windows cracked and broken. The shops she had passed only days ago were boarded up, their signs faded. The trees were withered, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. The town was still, but not empty. There was a faint rustle, a distant movement just beyond her reach. It wasn't just the town that had changed. She felt it deep within herself. The air tasted different, thick and metallic, like blood. The silence was louder now, more oppressive. And then she heard it, a low, rumbling sound, distant but unmistakable. A clock. The clock tower had followed her. Rowan turned around, but the tower was nowhere in sight. In fact, she didn't recognize anything about the town anymore. Pinebrook wasn't the sleepy little place she'd arrived in just days ago. It had become something else, something darker. And as Rowan stood in the shadow of the empty streets, she realized one terrifying truth. There was no escape from the 13th hour. Rowan's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in the middle of the distorted town square. The world around her had shifted once again, as though the fabric of reality had been pulled apart, thread by thread, and rewoven into something dark and twisted. The streets of Pinebrook, once quaint and familiar, now seemed more like a waking nightmare. The buildings, once charming and worn by time, had become ruins, decaying structures that loomed over her like the husks of forgotten memories. She took a step forward, her feet dragging against the cracked pavement. There was no breeze, no sound of the town's usual hum. The air itself was suffocating, thick and heavy, as though it was saturated with something malevolent. Rowan's breath caught in her throat. The longer she stood there, the more it felt like the town was pressing in on her, as though the ground itself was sinking beneath her feet. She glanced over her shoulder, but the clock tower was gone. The thing that had once been the town's heartbeat, the ticking, the chimes, the eerie presence of it, was no longer there. Instead, there was an emptiness, a void that swallowed every corner of the town. The buildings, the streets, the very air seemed to bend away from her, as though they too had been pulled into the same black hole that had consumed the clock tower. The world had shifted. Rowan rubbed her forehead, trying to steady herself. She had no idea how she had gotten here, or even when. Time, in this strange new world, no longer felt linear. It felt frozen, stuck in some kind of never-ending loop, like the clock tower had stolen away her ability to measure it. What happened to me? She thought. Her hands trembled as she grasped the edge of a nearby building, steadying herself against its crumbling stone facade. Her mind felt foggy, distant, as though she were trapped in a dream, unable to wake. A distant noise broke through the silence, a low, grinding sound, like metal scraping against metal. Rowan stiffened, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was coming from somewhere deep within the town, distant but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the old church, the one she had passed earlier, before everything had started to twist. With a deep, unsteady breath, she forced herself to move forward toward the sound. It was like some magnetic pull, an invisible force dragging her closer to it. She didn't know why, but she felt as if she had no choice. Her feet carried her through the streets, past houses that seemed to bend and flicker in her peripheral vision. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see something following her. A shadow, a figure, something from the corner of her vision. But each time she turned around, the street behind her was empty, as if she were the only living thing left in this broken place. By the time she reached the church, Rowan was breathless. The once pristine building now stood in ruins, its tall spire cracked and leaning, its stained glass windows shattered. The doors, however, were wide open, inviting her inside. The air around the church was thick, pulsating with an unnatural heat. Rowan felt the temperature rise as she stepped through the threshold. Inside, the church was dark, save for the dim light that filtered through the broken windows. The pews were overturned, the pulpit reduced to rubble. But something else was there, something out of place. The walls were covered in a series of symbols, drawn hastily with what looked like chalk or blood. They were crude, jagged marks that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own. As Rowan's eyes scanned the symbols, she felt a prickle of recognition, a familiar terror crawling up her spine. They looked like the same glyphs that had been carved into the box she had found in the clock tower. Rowan's breath hitched in her throat. She took a step back, her pulse racing as she realized she wasn't alone. A figure stood at the far end of the church, its back turned to her. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its shape barely distinguishable against the backdrop of the ruined altar. Rowan could feel its presence, the weight of its otherness pressing in on her from all sides. It was watching her. She took another step forward, her feet hesitant, but compelled by some force she couldn't understand. The figure remained still, its back still facing her. But as she got closer, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. There was something eerily familiar about it. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a whisper, low and rasping, yet somehow it filled the entire room. Rowan's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly turned, revealing its face. It wasn't a man, not exactly. It was someone she knew, or thought she knew. A faint impression of a person she had once seen in town, perhaps. But the face was wrong, twisted, distorted, with eyes too wide, too vacant. The skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular. It was like looking at a reflection in broken glass, fragmented and wrong. "I told you not to come," the figure repeated, its voice echoing in the hollow space of the church. "But now that you're here, it's too late." Rowan's pulse thundered in her ears. Her feet moved on their own accord, carrying her backward toward the door. But no matter how far she stepped, the figure remained fixed in her vision, its eyes following her every move. It was as if the world itself had become stuck, and the clock tower had pulled her, and everyone in Pinebrook, into this never-ending moment of dread. A moment when time stood still, and the past, present, and future blurred into one. "What is this?" Rowan choked out, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if it were amused by her question. "You know what I want," it said. "I want the truth." Rowan felt a chill run down her spine. Her stomach churned as she took another step back. The truth. What truth? The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The floor beneath her feet seemed to creak with each movement, the building groaning as if it were alive. "Everyone has secrets," it whispered, its voice filling the space around her like a dark cloud. "Everyone who came here, everyone who stayed, they all have something they wish to forget, something they can't escape." Rowan's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the pressure building in her chest. She knew that voice, knew that presence, but it wasn't just the figure that was talking now. It was the town itself. The walls of the church seemed to close in around her. The air was thick, suffocating, and the symbols on the walls, those same crude, twisted marks, seemed to move. They shifted, their shapes contorting into new forms, new patterns. They were alive with the same thing that had taken root in the town itself. "Your truth," the figure hissed, "is the only thing keeping you here. And if you don't confront it, you'll never leave." Rowan's heart raced as the world seemed to tremble. The floor beneath her feet shuddered, and the clock's ticking began to echo in her mind once again, relentless and oppressive. The 13th hour was coming, and Rowan knew that if she didn't face what she had been running from, she would be trapped here forever. The figure in the church moved toward Rowan slowly, its eyes gleaming in the darkness, unsettling in their emptiness. The echo of the 13th stroke still rang through her mind, every reverberation a hammer blow to her sanity. The symbols on the walls twisted and pulsed like living things, as if they were drawn from some ancient, forbidden language, one that belonged to the shadows of this place and no one else. Rowan's breath caught in her throat. She was running out of time. She could feel it pressing in on her, suffocating her from all sides, like the walls themselves had become a prison. The figure's voice, low and rasping, drifted toward her, each word leaving a residue of cold dread in her gut. "The 13th hour is the only hour that matters now, isn't it?" the figure whispered, its head tilting in a manner that made Rowan's spine curl. Its voice echoed, multiplying as if coming from every corner of the room, every inch of space. "You're in it, in the hour now. There's no turning back, no escaping the truth that waits in the silence." Rowan's legs trembled, the weight of its words pushing her down into the ground. She wanted to flee, but the door, now behind her, seemed so distant, so unreachable. There was nowhere to run. The town was gone. The clock tower was gone. She was trapped, buried under the pressure of something she couldn't quite understand. The truth was there, just beyond her grasp, but she couldn't see it clearly. "I don't know what you want," Rowan breathed, her voice shaky. "What is this place? Why me?" The figure smiled. No, grinned, its mouth splitting wide in a way that made her stomach turn. The teeth inside its mouth were jagged, too sharp, like something unnatural. "Don't you see? You've already answered your own question," it said, its voice smooth like velvet, though it felt anything but. "This town, the clock, the hour, it's all tied to your own truth. It's always been tied to you. This is where it began, Rowan. This is where it will end." The name hung in the air, like a curse, echoing in her ears. She couldn't breathe. Her pulse hammered in her throat. loud enough to drown out the figure's words. Rowan. The name felt strange, like a whisper from a forgotten past. She knew it, and yet she didn't. It was like a mirror reflecting someone else's life. She was here, in this ruined church, but who was she really? How much of her life, her memories, had been taken from her? What are you saying? Her voice was barely a whisper, the fear crawling up her throat. Her mind scrambled for answers, but they slipped through her fingers like smoke. She couldn't remember. She couldn't remember anything about this place before the 13th hour. The figure stepped closer, each footfall slow and deliberate, making the floorboards creak and groan under its weight. Not everything is meant to be remembered, Rowan. Some things are meant to be forgotten. But you cannot escape it, the figure intoned, its voice growing more insistent. You have been living in the loop for far too long. The hour, the 13th hour, it has been your hour. Rowan's chest tightened. Her hour. The words rang through her mind like a bell tolling in the distance, something far too old and too familiar. It was then that something cold flickered to the surface of her mind, something she had buried for far too long. The truth. I didn't, she began, but the figure cut her off with a sharp, biting laugh. Oh, but you did. You've always known. You've always been here, Rowan. The clock tower, the 13th hour. It all began with you, and now it will end with you. She shook her head, her fingers pressed to her temples. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls bending and twisting as if they were alive. Her mind felt like it was unraveling. She didn't know if she could trust anything anymore. Could she trust herself? Her thoughts became fragments, flashes of images, broken memories, like a shattered glass she was trying to piece together. The night of the accident, the sound of the car skidding, the screech of metal tearing into metal, the deafening silence that had followed, and then nothing. A blank space in her mind where the memories should have been. The figure's voice broke through the fog of her mind, deep and cutting. You were the one who caused it, Rowan. You were the one who killed them. The words struck her like a blow. The room swayed, the walls closing in around her. Killed them? She whispered, as if saying the words aloud could make them go away. But they didn't. They hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The figure nodded, its grin widening. You didn't mean to, it said, but you did. And now, you must pay for it. Every hour, every stroke of the clock. It's a reminder of your sin. Rowan staggered backward, her mind racing. She couldn't breathe. The truth, that truth, was clawing its way to the surface. She remembered now. The accident, the crash. It wasn't just her. There had been someone else in the car, someone she had tried to save, but she hadn't been able to. The scream, their scream, echoed in her mind as it had that night. The sound of a life slipping away, a life that she couldn't hold on to. She had run from it, from the guilt, from the truth, and now it had found her. The 13th hour had found her. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. The figure tilted its head, its eyes glittering with something between pity and malice. Sorry won't save you. Not now. Not here. Rowan turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the cracked floor, her breath ragged as she ran toward the exit, toward the door she had entered just moments ago. But the church had changed. The door was no longer there. The walls had closed in on her, trapping her in this nightmare. She spun in a circle, panic rising in her chest. The darkness pressed in, closing her off from everything. "You can't escape." The figure's voice echoed from all directions. "This is your prison, Rowan, the 13th hour, and it will never let you go." Rowan screamed. She pounded her fists against the stone walls, but they didn't give. They were as solid as death. The clock tower's chimes rang in the distance, distant but growing louder, louder until they drowned out everything else. 13 strokes. And as the final stroke tolled, the world went dark. Frank Harmon never meant to buy the box. Not at first. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon, the kind that dragged on like syrup. He'd been wandering through the small antique shop on the outskirts of town, the kind with thick layers of dust on the windows and the scent of mothballs and faded leather. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just passing time while his car was being serviced down the street. The place, the thrift and thing, had been there as long as he could remember, though it seemed to be growing more eccentric with age. The old man who owned it, Mr. Jebediah Pike, was a fixture in town, a relic from another time. Frank had always been curious about Pike, but not curious enough to ask questions. Pike had a way about him, something unsettling, like he was always watching, even when his eyes were closed. Frank had been idly flipping through old newspapers and cheap trinkets when the box caught his eye. It was tucked into the corner of a dim shelf, hidden behind stacks of vintage postcards and faded books. It wasn't much to look at, just a plain wooden box, old and worn, its surface marred by scratches and the passage of time. But there was something about it. An odd sensation crept up Frank's spine as he stared at it. He couldn't explain it, but he felt drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. Without thinking, Frank moved closer, his fingers brushing lightly against the rough wood. As he did, a chill ran through him. The air in the shop seemed to thicken, as though the box had somehow drawn the life out of the room, leaving only an uncomfortable stillness behind. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled carefully among the tattered lining, was a collection of delicate moths. The insects were preserved, pinned to small squares of parchment, their wings splayed in perfect symmetry. Each moth was different, ranging in size and color, their pale bodies a stark contrast to the dark box that contained them. Some were vibrant, with wings that shimmered in iridescent greens and blues, while others were darker, their wings stained a deep, almost black hue. Frank's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen moths like this before, at least not outside of a biology textbook. Each one was a work of art, a tiny marvel of nature preserved in time. Mr. Pike had appeared out of nowhere, standing in the shadows of the aisle, with his stooped back and crooked hands folded together like a prayer. Frank hadn't noticed him approach, and the sudden sound of his voice made him jump. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Pike's voice was raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in days. "Rare, too. You won't find anything like them around here." Frank looked up at the old man. Pike's eyes were watery, his face lined with deep wrinkles that made him look like he'd been carved from stone. There was something about his gaze, something unnerving, as though Pike could see into Frank's very soul. "How much?" Frank asked, his voice low, hesitant. He wasn't sure why he'd asked. It wasn't like he had any particular interest in moths. They were just pretty. They were just sitting there in that box, waiting. $50, Pike replied without hesitation, his mouth twitching as though he had been waiting for the question. a bargain, considering the rarity of the specimens. Frank hesitated. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to buy them. Maybe it was just the isolation of the place, or the strange pull that the moths seemed to have on him. Whatever it was, he found himself nodding, reaching into his pocket to pull out the cash. As he handed it over, Pike's eyes gleamed in a way that made Frank feel uneasy, but it was fleeting, and before Frank could question it, the old man was turning away, shuffling back into the shadows of the shop. "Take good care of them," Pike muttered, his voice trailing off. Frank left the shop with the box in hand, the strange weight of it pressing against his chest. He didn't think much of it at first. Just another odd purchase, another trinket to add to the growing pile of curiosities that cluttered his home. But as he drove back to his small apartment, the moths remained on his mind. There was something about them, something that tugged at the back of his thoughts. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that they weren't just ordinary insects. He wasn't sure why he felt that way, but it was as if something other was at work. That night, after he had settled in and eaten a quick dinner, Frank placed the box on the coffee table in his living room. He had the lights on low, the soft hum of his television filling the silence as he flipped through the channels, though he wasn't really paying attention. His gaze kept drifting back to the box, which sat innocently on the table, its lid now closed. The moths, he told himself, were just a curiosity. Beautiful, rare creatures, nothing more. But that night, after Frank went to bed, something began to stir. Frank woke with a start in the middle of the night, his body slick with sweat. He hadn't heard anything, but something had disturbed him. He sat up in bed, straining his ears to listen. The air in his apartment was thick, heavy, almost as though it were pressing in from all sides. It wasn't until he glanced toward the living room that he saw it. An eerie fluttering sound, like the soft rustling of paper, but amplified, coming from the direction of the table where the box sat. A moth. At first, Frank thought he was imagining things, but as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw it, small and pale, its wings shimmering faintly in the dim light of the lamp. It was perched near the ceiling, close to the light, its wings flapping slowly, almost hypnotically. Frank blinked. He was sure the moth hadn't been there before. How could it have been? He had closed the box. Hadn't he? His pulse quickened. He threw off the covers and walked out into the living room, his feet cold against the hardwood floor. The moth, no, there were two now, fluttered near the light, their bodies casting strange, angular shadows on the walls. The box. He looked at the table, and his stomach lurched. It was open. Frank could feel his throat constrict as he moved toward the box, the two moths now joined by a third. He didn't understand. How? How had they gotten out? As his hand reached for the box, he noticed something else, something he hadn't seen before. The moths, now gathered around the box, were not just flying aimlessly. They were moving in patterns, as if they were trying to form a shape he didn't understand. He could feel his pulse racing as the moths began to gather in a circle, and then, without warning, they all flew toward him, swirling around him like a cloud of wings. Their tiny bodies brushed against his skin, sending a chill up his spine. His heart raced as they began to form a pattern in the air, something that looked like writing. The insects had arranged themselves in lines, forming shapes he couldn't comprehend. It felt as if the air had thickened again, the weight of their presence pressing down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Frank staggered backward, his mind in a haze. He was trapped, surrounded by moths and symbols that danced in the air, their meanings lost to him. But one thing was certain. This was just the beginning, and it was only going to get worse. Frank didn't know how long he stood there, frozen in place, staring at the swarm of moths as they circled around him. The air was thick with their wings, a soft, almost rhythmic sound that was both soothing and terrifying. They fluttered around him like they were alive in a way that went beyond mere instinct. Their movements weren't random. They were calculated, deliberate, and they were forming something. He didn't understand it at first. He was too disoriented by the sheer volume of moths, hundreds of them now, filling the room, fluttering and twisting in the air like a living, breathing storm. But as the patterns began to take shape, the terror set in. They weren't just flying in circles. They were arranging themselves into something that resembled words, but not words he could understand. The symbols were jagged, broken, and angular, twisting like a language he had never seen before. Frank could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, a tight, strangling pressure in his chest. His hands trembled, but he reached for the nearest light switch, flicking it on with a snap. The light filled the room, casting harsh shadows across the walls, but the moths didn't scatter. They didn't flee like he'd hoped. Instead, they seemed to grow bolder in the light, the patterns becoming more distinct. He stared at them. The moths had gathered into a rough, almost hieroglyphic shape on the wall above the table where the box had sat. They shimmered as though they had a pulse, a strange, rhythmic beat that almost seemed to resonate inside him. He stepped closer, his breath shallow, every nerve in his body telling him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. A sudden sharp thud echoed in the room, a sound like a body dropping to the floor. Frank whipped around, his heart racing in his throat. The room was empty, no one there. But when he turned back toward the wall, something had changed. The symbols formed more distinctly now, their jagged edges pulsing with a faint glow that wasn't from the light. Frank's pulse quickened. He leaned in closer, squinting at the moths, trying to make sense of the strange pattern they had formed. It looked almost like an eye, a large, hollow eye made of moths. Frank backed away, his stomach turning over. The room felt colder now. The air itself seemed to change, becoming thicker, more oppressive. The ceiling fan above him whirred to life on its own, though there was no real breeze. The moths flew toward the fan, and the room hummed with an eerie, unnatural sound as they passed through the blades without being harmed. It was like the fan was part of the pattern, part of the ritual that was unfolding in front of him. The moths, his mind screamed at him, but there was no escape. There was nowhere to go. He could feel their presence now, feel them moving in the corners of his mind, like they were inside him, somehow burrowing into his thoughts. Every inch of the room was alive with their presence, the strange patterns continuing to form on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath his feet. It was as though the very space around him was shifting, folding in on itself. A voice, soft, almost imperceptible, whispered from the farthest corner of the room. It was a murmur, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it chilled him to the bone. "Do you see it?" the voice asked. It wasn't human. The words came through his thoughts, directly into his mind. "Do you see the pattern?" Frank spun toward the voice, his chest tight, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the dark corners of his apartment, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The moths swirled faster now, gathering around him, each one brushing past his skin as if they were trying to communicate something beyond what he could grasp. He staggered back, his hand fumbling for his phone. He needed to call someone, anyone. He couldn't make sense of what was happening, and he was terrified. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight as his fingers fumbled with the screen, trying to unlock the device. The moment the screen lit up, the moths all flew toward him, a chorus of fluttering wings filling his ears as they swarmed the phone, their tiny bodies hitting the screen with such force it almost knocked it from his hand. He screamed, jerking away as the moths swirled around him like a tornado, their wings battering him, his heart racing. A single word appeared on his screen, typed out by some unseen force. It was the same word, the one he'd seen in the pattern on the wall. Hunger. The word blinked on and off like some dark warning. Frank swore, his pulse racing as he dropped the phone to the floor, the glass cracking. He turned, his breath ragged, and tried to run toward the door. But the moment he moved, the moths followed, blocking his path, fluttering in his face, blinding him, smothering him. He swatted at them, his panic mounting. There were too many. He couldn't escape. Suddenly, the light above flickered, and then, without warning, it went out. The room was plunged into darkness. The air felt thicker now, colder. He could hear the fluttering of wings, the soft rhythmic sound growing louder and louder. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for the light switch, but it wouldn't turn on. The moths were everywhere now, a living, breathing cloud, and Frank could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on him. Then, a voice again. This time, it was clearer, sharper, as if coming from inside his head. "You cannot stop it!" Frank gasped, his breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred as the moths surrounded him, filling his mouth, his nostrils, his ears. He staggered back, his hands clawing at his face, trying to pull them away, but it was no use. They were inside him now. He could feel them. They were more than just insects. They were something else, something ancient, something beyond his understanding. The voice spoke again, but this time it was joined by others, as though the moths themselves were whispering in unison. "Hunger will feed on you until there is nothing left." And then, all at once, the moths disappeared. The air grew still again, silent, empty. Frank collapsed to the floor, his body trembling, drenched in sweat. His mind reeled, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Had it been real, or was it some kind of nightmare? But the words on his phone were still there, glowing faintly in the dark. Hunger. Frank awoke with a start, gasping for air, as if he'd been submerged underwater. His chest felt tight, as though something heavy were pressing down on him. He wasn't sure how long he had been out. Minutes? Hours? The shadows in the room were deep, the only light coming from the faint glow of the broken phone screen on the floor, still showing that single, haunting word. Hunger. He wiped his face with his trembling hand, feeling the sweat slick against his skin. He was disoriented, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to him like cobwebs. But it wasn't just a nightmare, was it? Number, it was real. The moths, those things, were real. Frank could feel their presence even now, as if they were waiting just beyond the edges of the room, their tiny wings beating softly in the darkness. He forced himself to sit up, his legs weak beneath him as he surveyed the room. The moths were gone. At least the swarm had vanished. The air was still, heavy, almost suffocating. The smell of damp earth and stale air filled his lungs, like a wet cloth pressed against his face. But something had changed. There was a faint hum, a sound just on the edge of hearing, like the low vibration of a power line swaying in the wind. It was barely perceptible, but it made his skin crawl. He stood, his legs shaking as he moved toward the window. He needed to get some fresh air. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around him, drawn tighter by some unseen force. He reached for the handle, but before he could pull it open, a fluttering sound echoed in the corner of the room, just behind him. Frank froze. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The box, the moth box. It was sitting on the table again, exactly where it had been when he'd first bought it. But now, it was open. He was sure he hadn't left it like that. He remembered closing it. He had closed it. The fluttering grew louder, more frantic. Frank's eyes locked onto the moths that were now emerging from the box, as though they were being released into the air, one by one. Their wings glowed faintly in the dim light, like the remnants of a forgotten dream. Hundreds, thousands of them, swirling into the air, their tiny bodies beating like the pulse of something alive, something ancient. The hum grew louder now, the air thick with their presence, each tiny movement sending a ripple through the room. Frank stumbled backward, his heart pounding against his ribs. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, deeper, until he could feel them pressing in on him. "Not again," he whispered, but his voice barely broke through the growing noise. The fluttering of wings drowned out everything else. A flash of white caught his eye, one moth standing out from the others. It flew toward him, its wings almost translucent, its shape somehow different from the rest. Frank reached out instinctively, his fingers trembling as he tried to grab it, to crush it, to do anything that would make it stop. But the moment his fingers brushed against its wings, the moth dissolved into ash, disintegrating in an instant. Frank gasped, pulling his hand back as the ashes swirled in the air around him. It was gone, but before he could process what had just happened, he saw something worse, something that made his blood run cold. The ash was reforming. From the corner of his eye, he saw the outline of the moth, his body slowly reconstituting, reforming from the ashes, its wings stretching back into place as if the death of the creature was nothing more than a temporary setback. A sickening realization washed over him. They regenerated. The moths weren't just coming back. They were growing stronger. A sharp pain in his head made him stagger, the overwhelming pressure building again. It was as if the very air around him had turned electric, crackling with an energy that had no business being there. The moths were drawing closer to him now, circling around him, pushing him back toward the wall. The more he tried to move, the more they swarmed, their wings brushing against his skin, creating an itching sensation that crawled beneath his flesh. It was like the air itself was alive, pulsing with the energy of the creatures. "No," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. "No, please." He tried to swat them away, but his hands felt like they were moving through molasses, slow and sluggish. The moths danced around him, mocking him, and with each flick of his hands, they only multiplied. The patterns they formed became more intricate, more complex, and Frank couldn't help but feel they were leading him somewhere, drawing him in. His thoughts spun faster, a whirlwind of confusion and terror. What was happening to him? To this place? Why couldn't he escape? The fluttering became deafening. The walls seemed to bend inward, closing off the space around him, trapping him in this living nightmare. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, the weight of something dark pressing in on him, suffocating him. And then, through the deafening noise, a voice broke through. Not a voice like the one before. This was different. It wasn't in his mind. It was real. "You have been chosen." Frank's heart stilled in his chest as he turned toward the door, the voice coming from the farthest corner of the room. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure of a man, a tall, gaunt figure whose face was obscured by a dark hood. He didn't move. He didn't speak again. But the words echoed in Frank's head, louder this time. "You have been chosen, and there is no escape." The moths fluttered in unison now, their wings filling the air like the beating of 1,000 hearts. And with each beat, Frank's vision began to blur, his thoughts scattering like the insects themselves. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The man's voice came again, as cold and unfeeling as the darkness closing in around him. "You cannot stop it, Frank. You cannot stop them. The hunger is endless." And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the room went silent. The moths were gone. The man was gone. Frank was alone again. He stood in the middle of the room, trembling, his body slick with sweat. His mind reeled, still echoing with the words of the voice. He wanted to scream, to break down, to understand what was happening, but there was no one there to listen. The phone. His broken phone lay on the floor, the screen cracked. Frank bent down to pick it up, his hands shaking as he turned it on. The same word flickered on the screen: hunger. He felt a cold dread crawl up his spine. Whatever had chosen him, whatever had brought him here, he couldn't escape it. The moths were only the beginning, and they were coming for him. Frank sat in the center of his living room, staring at the broken screen of his phone, the word hunger still blinking in the dim light. His hands were clammy, his breath shallow. He had to get a grip on himself, but the weight of it, whatever it was, pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. It had been hours since the swarm of moths had disappeared. His apartment felt eerily quiet, almost too quiet, as though the world had held its breath. But the silence was worse than the sound of their wings. The oppressive stillness gnawed at him, a reminder of the unseen presence lurking just beyond his reach. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The air still felt thick, a residue of the moth's presence, hanging in the room like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, feeling the cold sweat that clung to his skin. This can't be real. The thought was fleeting, more like a half-formed wish than an actual belief. He had to be dreaming, but everything felt too real. The fluttering wings, the broken phone, the voice that had called his name, the word hunger. Frank clenched his fists, a surge of anger bubbling up from the pit of his stomach. He wasn't going to be controlled by some invisible force. He wouldn't let this thing, this curse, take him. But when he turned toward the window, his breath caught in his throat. The night outside had deepened. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the streets below. It was the same view he'd had earlier in the day, yet now it felt wrong. distorted, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The streetlights flickered unnaturally, their glow sputtering as if fighting to stay lit. The room seemed to shift again, the shadows creeping longer, deeper. Something was changing. It wasn't just the walls closing in. The town itself was warping, bending at the edges of his vision, as if the very fabric of reality was stretching, pulling apart. Frank stumbled back, his head spinning. He tried to focus on the view outside, but the streets were wrong. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement, an odd distortion in the air. But then he saw it. A figure, tall and thin, with an unnatural gait, was walking down the street. The person moved in jerky motions, like a puppet on strings. The figure paused for a moment, and Frank's heart stopped as he saw the unmistakable silhouette. It was him, the figure in the street, walking slowly, deliberately, was Frank. His breath caught in his throat, his body trembling as he stumbled backward, away from the window. No, no, no. But as he watched, another figure emerged from the shadows. A second Frank, only this one wasn't moving quite like the first. His movements were more erratic, twitching unnaturally as though he were caught in some kind of endless loop. The first Frank, the one with the smooth, fluid motions, reached out toward the second, and in a split second, the two figures collided, merging into one. Frank's pulse hammered in his ears as the figure outside disappeared into the night. The world felt like it was breaking apart. Suddenly, the walls began to warp too. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, the corners of the room pulling inward, and the floor beneath him seemed to tilt. The air was so thick, it felt like he was wading through it, each breath harder to take. The window. He had to get out. He had to. His heart skipped a beat as he heard it, a soft fluttering, so quiet it was almost imperceptible, like the rustling of paper. Frank froze, listening. His mouth went dry. He could hear it again, and this time it was louder, closer. He turned, and there it was, the moth box, sitting innocently on the table, as if it had never been disturbed. The box was open once more. From the depths of the box, moths began to emerge, their fragile wings stirring the still air. Hundreds of them, thousands. Their wings buzzed like a distant storm, their bodies darting through the space, the shadows coming to life as they flitted through the room. Frank recoiled as the insects poured from the box, a swarm of fluttering wings and chitinous bodies. But this time, the air didn't just feel oppressive, it sounded wrong. The wings didn't create the usual soft hum. This sound was deeper. It felt like the sound of something alive, something hungry. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, the way they focused on him as they swarmed closer. He heard that voice again, the one from earlier, but now it was louder, more forceful. You're part of the pattern now, it whispered, the words dripping like venom. There's no way out. You belong to them now. Frank clutched his head, trying to block out the voice, but it echoed through his skull, reverberating with a cold, metallic hum that made his teeth ache. The moths were closing in, surrounding him, their wings brushing against his skin, their presence an overwhelming force. He could feel the pulse, the rhythm of their flight, as though they were breathing as one, connected to something far older than himself. The weight of their collective gaze pushed down on him, making his chest tighten, suffocating him with an invisible hand. But then something shifted. The swarm paused. Frank's body tensed. every muscle screaming to run, to escape, but his feet remained rooted to the floor. His mind fought to make sense of the bizarre pattern, the strange connection between the moths, the voice, the vision of himself in the street. Everything seemed to bleed together into one seamless nightmare. And then, a single moth detached from the swarm. It floated toward him, its wings glowing faintly in the dim light. It hovered just inches from his face, its eyes staring deep into his soul. Frank couldn't look away. His breath was shallow, his heart pounding in his throat. The moth's wings beat in slow, deliberate motion, each flap a thud in his chest. The hunger is within you now, the voice said again, and this time it was clear, undeniable. Frank's blood turned cold. He knew, deep down, what was happening. He had become part of the pattern, part of the cycle. Every night, every flutter of those wings, it was all drawing him deeper into whatever darkness lay at the heart of this twisted reality, and he was powerless to stop it. With one final, horrific flutter, the moth's wings beat against his skin, and Frank felt a coldness seep into him, a deep, gnawing coldness that filled every inch of his body. It wasn't just the moths, it was him. He was the one who had been chosen. Frank's breath was shallow, ragged, his eyes blurred, but the sharp clarity of the moth's presence burned into his vision. The fluttering wings reverberated inside his skull. Each beat a hammer against the fragile walls of his mind. It wasn't just the insects, it was the hunger, that dark, gnawing hunger that had taken root inside him, spreading its tendrils deep into his chest. The moth's wings beat closer, slower, until it was only inches away from his face. Its eyes, if such things could be called eyes, stared directly into his soul. Its wings shimmered like stained glass, fractured and broken in the dim light of his apartment. And all the while, that voice lingered in the air, sharp and cold. You have been chosen, Frank. You were always meant to be here, to become part of it. His pulse quickened, his hands trembling at his sides. Chosen. The word repeated in his mind, a sickening mantra. He tried to move, to escape, but his body refused to respond. It was as if the very air had thickened around him, holding him in place. The moth hovered closer. Frank could feel the coolness of its presence, the way it seemed to draw the warmth from his skin. His vision began to blur, his thoughts becoming slow, sluggish. The edges of reality felt as though they were peeling away, fraying like the thin, brittle pages of an old book left too long in the sun. The moth's gaze was pulling him down, deeper and deeper into that dark place where time itself no longer held meaning. They're waiting for you, the voice whispered again, this time softer, almost like a lover's caress. The cycle is already in motion. There is no escape from it, Frank. No way out. The room began to spin. The walls bent, warped by the weight of the moth's presence. He could see the shadows moving, twisting unnaturally. The floor felt soft, as if it were made of cotton, shifting beneath him. His legs buckled beneath the weight of it all, and he collapsed to his knees, the moths still swirling around him. He gasped, unable to breathe, as the air thickened with the stench of damp earth and rot. The hunger, he felt it now, deep within himself, gnawing at the edges of his mind. It wasn't just the moths. He was becoming part of the hunger. He could feel it, an insidious force wrapping itself around his heart, squeezing until the pressure in his chest was unbearable. No, he whispered, but the word was hollow, swallowed by the ever-deepening darkness. No, I won't. But his body betrayed him. He felt the pulse within him, the same pulse that had been inside the moths, the same pulse that had been in the air, in the shadows. The hunger was now part of him. It had infected him, seeped into his bones and marrow, and there was no escaping it. The box. He looked toward the moth box, still open on a table, surrounded by the fluttering bodies of the creatures. His mind screamed for him to stay away, to resist, but his body, his own body, betrayed him again, moving him toward the box as though he were a puppet, strings pulled by a hand he couldn't see. The moths parted before him, revealing the inside of the box. The ashes from the previous moth that had disintegrated were still there, scattered like dust. Frank's fingers trembled as they brushed against the remnants. It was all connected. He felt that now, felt the twisted web that tied him to this place, to the cycle of destruction and rebirth. It was as though the moths weren't just living creatures. They were memories. They were pieces of something much older, a force far beyond comprehension. Suddenly, the box clicked closed. Frank jumped back, his heart racing, but he didn't understand why. It was like an instinct, his body telling him that something had changed, that the moment the box had closed, the cycle had begun again. He wasn't meant to leave. He wasn't meant to escape. He turned, frantic, eyes wild, searching for a way out. But the room was no longer his own. The walls closed in, pressing against him like the weight of the earth itself. The lights flickered, casting everything into a surreal half-light. The shadows on the walls twisted into shapes that seemed to leer at him, mocking him with their shifting forms. The air was cold now, too cold, and the scent of rot was thick enough to choke on. And then it came, the hunger, a low hum, deep in his gut. The moths had returned, hundreds, thousands. Their wings beat against him like a rising tide, the sound deafening. It was impossible to tell where the walls ended and where the swarm began. Every corner of the room was filled with them, a mass of fluttering wings and whispering voices. Frank stumbled backward, his legs buckling beneath him, his arms flailing for balance. The voice that had been tormenting him since the first moment he'd seen the moths, echoed again, louder this time, almost triumphant. You are part of the cycle now, Frank. You are one of us, and every time the 13th hour strikes, we will come for you. We will come for your soul. The words reverberated in his skull, and Frank felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of hopelessness. He understood now, more than ever, what this was. He had been chosen, but not in the way he had imagined. The moths weren't just drawn to him. They needed him. He was part of the cycle. He was food. The floor beneath him began to shift again, warping and twisting, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing beneath him. He could see the street outside, but it was wrong, distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. A piece of his mind screamed in defiance, but it was drowned out by the endless beating of wings, by the dark hunger that had settled deep within him. He looked around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was nothing left to see. The walls had vanished, the room had disappeared, and in its place was an endless, empty expanse of blackness, stretching out to infinity. The moths swarmed around him, their wings beating in time with the pulsating hum in his chest, the hunger that now defined him. He could feel it consuming him, wrapping around his soul, suffocating him, and in that moment, Frank understood. He would never escape. He was part of the cycle now, part of the moths, part of the hunger, forever. The first thing Michael noticed was the label. It was tattered, as if someone had spent far too many hours turning the record over and over again, caressing it, letting it pass through their hands like a secret. The paper was yellowing, the edges curling up with age, but it wasn't the age that caught his eye. It was the handwritten script that sprawled across it like a wisp of forgotten words. No artist name, no album title, just a single phrase. Play me, but know what you lose. He stared at it for a long time, longer than any sane person would, until the words began to look like they were pulsing, moving, whispering in a way that made the back of his neck prickle. It was an odd thing to see in an antique store, the sort of place where the musty smell of old wood mixed with a faint, bitter scent of time. Dust sat in every corner, and the yellow lights above flickered occasionally, as if fighting the weight of decades. The store was crowded with relics, old clocks that had stopped ticking years ago, tarnished silver spoons, and piles of forgotten photographs. But this record, placed on a low shelf at the back, stood out. The other records were carefully stacked, their covers pristine, names printed boldly in slick fonts, but not this one. It had been thrown to the back, as if it didn't belong. Michael leaned closer, his fingers itching to touch it. The air was thick with a scent of something strange, a mix of decay and mystery. He wasn't sure why, but something about the record made him want to reach out, as though it were calling to him, begging for him to take it, to listen to it. Odd choice, said a voice from behind him, breaking his reverie. He spun around, heart racing, and found himself face to face with the shopkeeper, a tall man with an unnerving, gaunt face and eyes that seemed to never blink. The kind of man you'd forget the second you turned away, but whose presence lingered like a bad smell. You know, that's not a record you just pick up. The shopkeeper continued, his voice low, almost hypnotic. Not if you know what's good for you. Michael blinked, confused. What do you mean? He looked down at the record again, the strange phrase still imprinted in his mind. The shopkeeper eyed him with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. You don't really know what you're buying. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Not everyone who listens to it comes out the same, or at all. The words hung in the air like a warning, but Michael wasn't the type to be easily scared. He had come here, to this dark little store, for a reason, to find something that might fill the silence in his life, the emptiness he couldn't seem to shake. And here it was, that pull, that inexplicable need to know what it was. He knew the shopkeeper was probably just trying to make a sale, but there was something in his voice that made his skin crawl, something that made him doubt his instincts. I'll take it, Michael said, his voice steady. The shopkeeper didn't try to stop him. Instead, he nodded and reached out to take the record, almost too eagerly, as though he were handing it off to someone else, as if he didn't want to touch it any longer than necessary. His long fingers wrapped around the edge of the vinyl, and for just a second, their hands brushed. Michael's skin tingled where their fingers met, as if a jolt of electricity had shot through him. $30, the shopkeeper muttered, his eyes flicking to the record before meeting Michael's gaze again. You won't regret it, not until it's too late. Michael drove home with the record tucked carefully in the passenger seat of his car. It was a long, quiet drive back to his apartment, the kind of drive that made him reflect on everything that had led him here. The endless days of feeling disconnected, of trudging through life as if it were a routine he couldn't break free from. He was drawn to the past. He always had been. The old stories, the antiques, the records that held memories of lives he would never know. It was why he had come to this small town in the first place, why he had picked this particular antique store over all the others. He had always found comfort in the things that seemed forgotten by time, as if they offered him a bridge to another world, a different version of life. But there was something strange about this record, something that tugged at him in ways he couldn't explain. It had been left in that dusty corner of the shop for a reason. By the time he got home, the moon was high in the sky, casting pale light across the apartment's small living room. He set the record down gently on the coffee table, still unable to shake the feeling that it was more than just an old piece of music. The turntable was the same one he had inherited from his father, an old wooden thing that hummed quietly when it started up. He placed the needle carefully on the record's edge, watching as the grooves caught the light. The silence stretched in the room, thick and heavy, before the first note spilled out. At first, it was soft, a haunting melody, played slowly, as if the record itself were hesitant to speak. But as the music filled the room, it began to grow, to swell with a strange, eerie beauty that seeped deep into his bones. It was the kind of music that made you feel as though you were standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into something dark and endless. Michael closed his eyes, letting the notes wash over him. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made him feel as though he was slipping into a dream he couldn't quite wake up from. The world around him began to change. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. He opened his eyes, and the room looked the same. His apartment, the worn-out couch, the chipped coffee mug sitting on the table. But something felt off. The air seemed thicker now, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing in on him. He reached for his drink, a glass of water he'd set down earlier, but when his hand brushed against it, the glass shifted, just slightly. It was as though it had moved when he wasn't looking, but he was sure he hadn't touched it. His pulse quickened, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He leaned forward, staring at the glass, watching as it slowly, deliberately, moved again. He blinked. The glass had not moved. It was exactly where he had left it. But something had shifted. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the music continued to play. The melody had changed, become more frantic, more dissonant. The notes seemed to run together, overlapping, distorting, creating an almost unbearable tension. He could feel it building within him, rising from his gut to his chest, his throat tightening. The room seemed to grow colder, darker. His breath fogged up in the air in front of him, a thin mist hanging like a veil. Something wasn't right. He sat back slowly, unable to tear his eyes away from the turntable. The needle skipped across the grooves, dragging the sound out, twisting it, stretching it into something far more sinister. And then the world began to change. Time seemed to slip, as if the fabric of it was starting to unravel. A moment ago, he had been sitting on the couch, but now he wasn't sure where he was. The room felt farther away. The light from the window, the same light he had been watching just moments before. looked different. The shadows had shifted. The air in the room felt older. Before he could make sense of what was happening, the music hit a sharp, shrill note, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he heard something, someone in the distance. A voice, faint but growing clearer. "Get out, get out, get out." The voice was softer now, its edges frayed, as though it were muffled by a thick layer of wet cloth, but it was unmistakable. A call, a warning, rising from the farthest reaches of the apartment, distant but so incredibly close, as though it was sitting in the room with him, breathing the same air. "Get out, get out, get out." The words rattled through him like the shaking of bones. Michael's breath caught in his throat, his hand frozen above the turntable. The air was thick now, as if it had become a physical thing that pressed down on his chest, threatening to suffocate him. The room, his small apartment that had always felt so familiar, now felt strange, alien. The shadows in the corners of the room grew deeper, creeping in on him, closing in from all sides. Michael ripped his eyes away from the turntable, his pulse pounding in his ears. The voice, it had been a voice, hadn't it? Was gone now, faded into the fog that seemed to fill the room. He reached out, his hand trembling, and turned the volume dial on the stereo. The needle jumped, and the eerie melody warbled for a moment before settling back into the same unsettling tune. But the air didn't settle. No, it thickened. The coldness in the room wrapped around him like a damp cloth, clinging to his skin, crawling into his lungs. The music itself seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The strings that had once been soft now screeched, the piano notes growing sharp, jagged, as if the very record was tearing itself apart under the pressure of the needle. But still, he couldn't look away. He didn't want to. There was something compelling about it, something that forced him to listen, to stay, even as his instincts screamed at him to run, to tear the record from the turntable and smash it to pieces. His hands shook as he grabbed the edge of the record, his fingers closing around the grooves, the cool vinyl surface smooth under his touch. For a moment, he considered stopping it, just stopping the madness. But the pull was undeniable. It was as if the music was wrapped around his very soul, like a thread tied so tightly around his chest that it would suffocate him if he didn't keep listening. He lowered his hand, almost against his own will, and let the needle continue its steady crawl. The melody seemed to stretch, to elongate, each note pulling him deeper, drawing him further into its grasp. His eyes began to flicker. The shadows, those deep corners of his apartment, seemed to bleed into one another, twisting and stretching, as though they were trying to crawl toward him, to reach him. The world outside the apartment seemed to disappear. The faint streetlights that had always peeked through his window faded into nothing. The low hum of traffic, a sound he had never truly noticed before, fell silent. It wasn't just the shadows that were shifting. The very fabric of reality felt as though it was being tugged in every direction. And Michael knew, without a single doubt, that it was the record that was causing it. The music. It wasn't music anymore, not in the way he understood it. It had become something else, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. A screeching, whining, distant howl of something ancient and unknown, something that shouldn't be heard by human ears. And yet, here he was, trapped in its spell. The world around him seemed to fold, its edges blurring, the apartment stretching and twisting in impossible directions. His eyes flicked toward the door. The hallway outside, the one that should have led to safety, now seemed to be shifting in time with the music. It was all wrong. The walls, which had once been white, now looked old, cracked. The carpet, once soft underfoot, seemed to be sinking into the floor, swallowed up by the deepening shadows that had started to crawl across it like a dark tide. Michael stood up abruptly, his legs unsteady beneath him. His head swam, his vision swirled. He needed to leave. He had to get out. He reached for the door handle, but before his hand could touch it, the sound of the record changed. The needle had moved. Click. The sound was sharp, cutting through the chaos like a knife. It was almost like the music had paused, like it had taken a breath, waiting for something or someone to act. And then everything stopped. The room fell silent. The shadows halted mid-reach. The music gone, leaving an emptiness so absolute, so deep, it was as though he had been dropped into the void. Michael's breath hitched. He felt as though he had just stepped off a cliff, falling, weightless, into a space that wasn't quite real. The silence stretched. It was unbearable. His throat closed, and for a moment he couldn't even hear his own heartbeat. He dared to glance toward the turntable. There, where the record had been spinning, the needle had stopped dead. The silence continued, stretching on, as though the record had locked itself in place, frozen, waiting for him to make the next move. His heart pounded, and sweat beaded along his forehead. The tension in the room was palpable now, the silence ringing in his ears. His body tensed, a quiet, primal fear creeping into his chest. Then it happened. The record began to play again, but it wasn't like before. It wasn't the same music. It was backwards. The notes, once haunting and beautiful, were now jumbled, distorted, as though time itself was being pulled backward, twisted into something grotesque. The sounds that filled the room no longer soothed. They scraped and screeched, reverberating through the apartment like an agonized scream. And Michael, his breath catching in his throat, realized something terrible. The music wasn't just playing backward, time was, too. He stumbled back, clutching at his chest, feeling his pulse race. The room around him seemed to warp. The walls were moving in a slow, maddening rhythm. The shadows, those creeping things that had once seemed like figments of his imagination, were now crawling backward as well, their dark forms melting and reforming in reverse. He turned toward the window. The night sky, which had been dark and still moments ago, now began to roll backward like an old film reel. The stars disappeared, as if someone were rewinding the world itself. The moon slowly retreated, drawing itself away from the sky, as if it had never been there. But the worst part, the people who should have been moving in the world outside his window, they were going backward, too. Michael's stomach turned as he saw them, figures on the street below, walking in reverse, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. Cars pulled backward into their driveways. The sound of a honking horn played out in reverse, the car tires sliding backward along the road. He was watching it, watching time rewind itself, as though he were in a dream, but he was awake, wide-eyed and full of panic. He turned back to the turntable. The record spun faster now, the reverse melody growing louder, like the scream of an ancient beast. And Michael realized, with a gut-wrenching clarity, that it wasn't just the world that was rewinding. It was him. He was being pulled backward, too. Michael stood frozen, unable to comprehend what his eyes were telling him. The world outside the window was folding in on itself, its edges blurring like a photograph left too long in the sun. Figures moved backward down the street, mothers with strollers, pedestrians with their heads turned unnaturally, cars sliding backward as if the world were reversing, an infinite rewind to a place and time that no longer made sense. He blinked, disoriented, but the view didn't change. He wasn't dreaming. He wasn't hallucinating. The music, it had changed again, growing sharper, more insistent, pulling everything toward it, pulling everything back. The needle dragged across the grooves of the record in a manner that was both chilling and mechanical. It was as if it were feeding on him, his mind, his very essence, pulling him into the past, inch by agonizing inch. The record was playing him now. Michael stumbled back, feeling the weight of his own confusion and terror pressed down on him like a vice. He clutched at the back of the couch, his fingers digging into the frayed fabric, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to this reality. His breath came in short gasps, his pulse hammering in his chest. He could feel the edges of his thoughts fraying, snapping like thin threads. The room continued to warp around him. The clock on the wall, which had once ticked methodically, now spun in reverse, its hands turning back slowly, unnaturally, as if it were trying to undo every second of the last hour. His own heart felt like it was beating in reverse, pulling him backward through moments he couldn't even fully grasp. The clock's face grew dimmer, then brighter again, as if time itself was breathing. And the music, it was a nightmare now, shrill and distorted, a cacophony of backward strings, piano notes twisted into impossible shapes, each note dissonant, each sound worse than the last. The melody scraped against his mind like the claws of a beast raking down glass, and he had to tear himself away from it. His hand reached out, almost against his will, toward the turntable, but his fingers couldn't quite reach it. It was as though the turntable itself were shifting backward, moving out of his grasp. The room around him stretched as if the very air was distorting, pulling him toward the past. He blinked. The past? The realization hit him like a slap to the face. He wasn't just being pulled backward in time. The world around him, the one he had known for years, was unraveling. The people outside, the streets, everything was fading, becoming a blur of motion and sound. The world was beginning to lose its shape. His mind raced, trying to understand the impossible truth. His eyes darted around the room, panic tightening around his chest. What was happening? Why was this happening? The shadows that had once seemed innocuous now filled the space, swirling in the corners, creeping along the walls, stretching into places they shouldn't be. They reached for him, their dark tendrils pulling at his legs, wrapping around him, trying to drag him deeper into the suffocating darkness. And then it hit him. He was fading. His very being, his body, his memories, everything was slipping, like the tape of an old film slowly disintegrating, leaving only fragments behind. He wasn't just witnessing time rewind. He was becoming part of it. It was in the way his reflection in the window seemed to blur and distort, stretching outward like a half-formed ghost. His own face twisted, his features momentarily erased as the world around him collapsed in reverse. He stumbled backward, the room spinning faster now, dizzying, making him nauseous. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees on the hardwood floor, gasping for air that no longer felt fresh. but musty and stale, as though it had been trapped in this room for decades. The music was louder now, thrumming through his skull, the distorted sound reverberating in his bones. His body quivered in response, the vibrations sinking into him, crawling under his skin like an infection. Desperately, Michael dragged himself toward the turntable. His fingers hovered over the needle, trembling. The moment he touched it, the record spun faster, the melody distorting even more, the notes warping so violently that it felt like his very soul was being ripped from him. He yanked the needle off, but it didn't matter. The music was still there, filling every corner of the room, rushing at him from all sides. He couldn't escape it. It was inside him now, wrapping around his insides like vines choking the life from a tree. And that voice, the same one that had whispered, "Get out" earlier, now screamed in his mind, "You cannot escape time." The room spun faster. The walls blurred into motion. The shadows were no longer just in the corners. They were everywhere. They crawled up his legs, his arms, consumed him. His vision grew blurry. He couldn't tell if he was seeing the present or something else, another time, another place. His mouth was dry, his throat raw from breathing air that felt too old. "Please, God," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the shrieking music. "I need to stop this." The room seemed to tilt, the edges of the walls folding inward, like the opening of an ancient book, pulling him deeper into its pages. His body, his consciousness, everything was twisting in reverse. And that was when he saw it. In the reflection of the window, where the street should have been, he saw himself, but not the man he was now. The reflection was distorted, like a memory fading, but there was something else, something darker. His reflection was smiling. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. He knew it, and yet there it was, grinning at him, a malevolent version of himself that reached out from the glass, its eyes black and hollow, its mouth stretched wider, its grin growing impossibly large. "You should have listened," the reflection whispered, and for a moment, Michael thought he felt his body move without him. It was as if the shadow of himself was doing things his body wouldn't allow. The reflection's hands began to scratch at the window, its fingers leaving dark streaks of black across the glass. The record played on, louder, faster, the melody now almost unintelligible, as if it were becoming a part of the madness that was consuming the apartment. He could hear the reflection, its voice rising over the music, like an echo from a distant time. "You can't stop what's already begun." Michael's heart hammered in his chest as the walls grew closer, the shadows clinging to him. His reflection was still there, still smiling. No, grinning, its eyes blacker than pitch. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was alive, a part of him, a twisted version of himself that had broken free and was pulling him deeper, into the past, into the dark. And as his body began to disintegrate, a single thought crashed through the storm in his mind. The past was taking him. Michael felt the pull of the reflection growing stronger. It wasn't just a glimpse now. His twisted double grinned at him, its dark eyes burning with something darker than mere malice. It was hungry. Hungry for what? Michael couldn't tell, but the gnawing feeling in his gut told him everything he needed to know. The glass beneath the figure's fingers was cracking, the dark streaks bleeding into the apartment's air like ink, painting everything with a sense of impending doom. The room seemed to narrow, to collapse inward. The shadows grew long and thick, stretching across the floor, up the walls, and coiling like serpents around his legs, pulling him down. He gasped, trying to move, but the air was thick, impossibly heavy. It pressed on his chest as if the very atmosphere had turned to lead. His reflection, it was him, but it wasn't. It was becoming more real, more substantial with every passing second. Its grin twisted wider, as if it were feeding off his fear, his panic. The man who once stood in front of that window was now no longer just a reflection. It was an entity that seemed to feed on the unraveling of Michael's mind, his body. And then, as if the world had collapsed into itself completely, the reflection whispered, "You're mine now." The voice, a low rasping sound that crawled under his skin like the fingers of a ghost, echoed in his mind. Michael's body tensed, his muscles locked in place. His limbs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and immovable. The shadows around him thickened, blending with the air until it felt like the very essence of the apartment itself was a part of him, pressing in on all sides. The music, it was still playing, still twisting, still warping the fabric of time and space. It felt like an eternity had passed, but Michael knew deep in his gut that it hadn't. Time had become fluid. The world wasn't following its natural path. It was bent, like a reflection in a warped mirror. The reflection in the window reached its hands through the glass. No, past the glass, until its fingers touched Michael's skin. The chill shot through his body like ice, and for a moment, he felt the distinct sensation of losing himself. He jerked backward, his breath ragged, his heart hammering as if it were trying to escape his chest. But it wasn't just a reflection. The room itself was changing now. More than that, it was alive. The walls pulsated with the same beat as the warped music. The air was thick with a weight he couldn't bear, suffocating him, pushing him deeper into a place he didn't understand. The world outside the window, the street, the cars, the people, was no longer visible. It was gone. He reached for his phone on the coffee table, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. But the screen was black. Nothing. The familiar comfort of modern life, the digital world he had taken for granted, was gone. The house was empty. The world outside was empty. And then, with a sickening lurch, Michael realized what was happening. It was all unwinding. He was unwinding. The shadows in the corners seemed to lean toward him now, gathering, their tendrils like claws scraping against the floor. The room was alive with movement, alive with a hunger he couldn't explain. The shadows seemed to feed on the broken pieces of time, on the cracks that had formed in his mind. It was as if the very nature of the world had shifted, and now it was bending to something darker. The music reached a crescendo, a terrifying, jagged clash of sound, and then stopped abruptly, leaving the room in a ringing silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but heavy, oppressive, a silence that was full of waiting. The turntable and the record spun on its own. It moved impossibly, as if it were being controlled by some unseen force. The needle crept back to the beginning of the track. Michael's hands trembled at his sides. His legs were unsteady beneath him. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. His mind was a cloud of panic, his senses scrambling to understand what was happening. And then, click. The needle dropped onto the record once more. The music began to play again. But this time, it was different. It was no longer just a warped melody. The sounds were voices now, whispers, low and guttural, almost unintelligible, like an old language forgotten by time. They filled the room, slipping into his ears, crawling beneath his skin. It was like hearing the voices of people he had never known, but who had somehow always been with him, waiting for this moment, waiting for him to realize that he was the one who was trapped here. His breath came faster now, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum, and he realized with a gut-wrenching clarity that the music wasn't just altering time, it was rewriting it. The walls began to warp again, but this time they didn't simply stretch and blur, they fractured. Small cracks appeared in the plaster, spider-webbing out across the walls, growing larger, wider, until the entire room seemed to splinter. The floor beneath his feet began to creak, the boards groaning in protest, as if the apartment itself were trying to tear itself apart. And then, that dark, otherworldly presence that had been gnawing at the edges of his sanity for what felt like years, began to speak to him, not through the reflection, not through the music, but from somewhere deeper, from somewhere within. Time is no longer your ally. The voice was cold, an ancient thing that resonated in his bones, in his very soul. It wrapped around him like chains, tightening, dragging him down, pulling him deeper into a place where time didn't exist at all, where there was only the music, only the distortion, only the record. Michael's eyes widened in horror. The reflection, the thing that had been smiling at him, had now fully crossed into the real world. It was no longer trapped in the glass. It was standing before him, grinning like a predator, its black eyes gleaming with malice. He could feel it now, the coldness that came off of it, the emptiness, the thing that wasn't him, but was a part of him, a thing that had always been there, waiting for its moment to claim him. And it was here. We've waited a long time, the thing whispered, its voice jagged and broken like the music, like 1,000 shattered voices coming from the same source. Michael felt the world shift beneath him again, a violent lurch that sent him stumbling backward. The apartment was collapsing around him, warping with each note of the record that spun endlessly, over and over, each rotation pulling him deeper, erasing everything he had ever known. He reached out, his fingers scrambling for something, anything to hold on to, but the air itself was breaking apart. The floor beneath him was no longer solid. It was soft, like wet clay, and as he tried to step forward, he sank into nothing. The blackness that had been creeping around the room was now swallowing him whole, a vast void that seemed to stretch forever, pulling him into a place where time itself had no meaning. There was only the record, only the sound, only the darkness. And as Michael's body was pulled into the void, his last thought, his final, desperate thought, was that he had never been meant to escape. Michael's body fell through the void, but it wasn't like falling at all. It was more like floating, drifting in some dark space between breaths, between moments, between worlds. There was no ground, no ceiling, no sky, no point of reference, just the weightless pull of the blackness, a vacuum that seemed to swallow him whole. His mind was splitting open. He could feel it unraveling, like the seams of a worn-out coat, as if the very core of his being was coming apart, layer by layer. The memories, their sharp edges, their moments of pain and joy, were fading, slipping into the darkness like sand running through his fingers. They weren't important anymore, were they? Nothing was. Nothing mattered in this place. It was just him. And the record, a faint, haunting melody, echoed through the vastness, distorted but familiar, stretching out like a tether, a lifeline to the only reality left. He tried to grab hold of it, to reach out, but the air here was thick, viscous, like tar that slowed every movement. The music filled his ears, louder now, reverberating through the space around him. It was twisted, but it was him. It was his pulse, his heartbeat. It was the last thing he could understand. The needle dropped again. Click. The record spun, and it was no longer just music. It was a voice, 1,000 voices. You're here now, forever. Welcome home. It was a whisper, a growl, a scream all at once, rattling his bones and echoing in the empty chasm around him. Michael's skin prickled. His heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes, wide with fear, darted around the void. There was no escape. There had never been. The shadows were everywhere now. They weren't just lingering in corners. They were spreading, crawling, devouring the space between him and everything he used to know. And the reflection, the one that had grinned at him from the window, the one that had stalked him in the apartment, it was here now, too. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was him. It was his darkness, and it stood before him, smiling with that twisted, hungry grin. Its voice came, slow, deliberate, like a serpent uncoiling in the dark. I told you, you're mine now. You've always been mine. You can't leave. The reflection stepped forward, and the air in the void seemed to ripple, vibrating with an energy that Michael couldn't comprehend. The walls, if they could even be called walls, melted around them, warping like the edges of a badly burned photograph. The darkness swirled, a living thing, wrapping itself around the two of them like a shroud. Michael wanted to scream, to run, but the air was too thick, and his body, his own body, felt so distant, like he was no longer in control of it. His arms and legs hung limp by his sides. The fear, the terror that had once surged through him, was fading, replaced by an overwhelming emptiness, a cold that seeped into his bones, and a dread so deep it felt like it had always been there. This was it. This was the end. There was nothing left but the record. Nothing left but the whispering voices and the crushing silence that followed. The reflection. No, it was him now, wasn't it? Reached out with long, clawed fingers. Michael couldn't pull away. He didn't want to. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The fingers brushed his face, cold as death, and as they did, the world around him shattered like glass. For a moment, Michael wasn't sure if he was still breathing. He wasn't sure if he was even alive. He blinked, and the blackness started to fade, the shadows peeling away like old skin. The room, his apartment, appeared again, except it wasn't the same. Everything was different, distorted, like a warped reflection in a broken mirror. The walls were cracked and stained, the carpet soaked with a dark substance that looked like dried blood. The air was stale, suffocating, thick with the smell of decay. And the record was still playing, but it wasn't on the turntable anymore. It was in him. Michael could feel it, its rhythm, its pulse, echoing in his skull. The music was no longer something external. It was a part of him. It was inside, coiling in his veins, crawling under his skin like worms. The reflection, his reflection, was gone, but it didn't matter. It had already consumed him. He could still feel its presence, the darkness that had crept into every part of him. The whispers were still there, growing louder, gnawing at his mind, until they drowned out everything else. You've always been here. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was all around him, filling the room, crawling under his skin. It was everything and nothing all at once. He couldn't escape it. He was part of it now. And the music, he could hear it clearer than ever before. Every note, every distorted sound seemed to bleed into his very soul. It was his heartbeat, his pulse, his mind. It had always been this way. The record had always been playing. He had only ever been a part of the song, a fleeting note in its endless refrain. Time is broken, the voice said, and this time it was not just an echo. It was a command. Michael's vision blurred, the walls of the apartment warping around him. The floor trembled beneath his feet, and the shadows rose, towering over him, swirling, pulling him toward the center of the room. He tried to move, to scream, but his body betrayed him. His limbs were heavy, frozen in place. The room was closing in. The shadows, the whispers, everything was becoming one with him, and he couldn't tell where he ended and it began. He was becoming the record. He was becoming the song that never ended. The melody that twisted time and reality, that distorted everything it touched. And then the needle dropped again. Click. The world began to spin backward,